Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope today finds you well. Thank you for your patience. We wanted to make sure we were up and running on all of our platforms. It's great to see you all again this evening. I am Keisha Lance Bottoms, Mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, the cradle of the civil rights movement in America. And thank you for joining us for our second virtual hearing of the 2020 Platform Drafting Committee. And thank you to everyone who's online watching the live stream and to the drafting committee members who are with us today. We had a productive hearing on Monday, and I look forward to hearing the insights from those who are joining us on today. Before we begin, please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before we get into our agenda today, I'd like to introduce again the drafting committee members. This is a remarkable group of people who are leaders in the forefront of their fields, and their expertise will be an invaluable resource during this process. We have Dr. Tony Allen, who is the president of Delaware State University. Stuart Applebaum is the president of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Congresswoman Catherine Clark represents the 5th Congressional District in Massachusetts. Senator Tammy Duckworth serves as the junior senator from the state of Illinois. Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia represents the 29th Congressional District in Texas. Dr. Heather Gottney is an associate professor at Fordham University. Don Graves is a former domestic and economic policy director in the office of Vice President Biden. Congresswoman Deb Haaland represents the 1st Congressional District in New Mexico. Analia, I wanted to make sure I got it right, and I had to smile because I was so proud of myself. Analia Mejia served as the political director on the Bernie 2020 campaign. Josh Orton serves as a senior advisor to Senator Sanders. State Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez is a member of the Florida Senate representing the 37th District. Julianne Smith serves as a senior advisor to the president of the German Marshall Fund. Richard Trumka is the president of the AFL-CIO. And Tom Vilsack is a former Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama. In addition, we have Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who will serve as an ex officio member and was a member of the 2016 Drafting Committee. And then we have 2 special guests joining us today. We have Julie Chavez Rodriguez, and she is joining us to observe this evening. She is also a co-chair of the Platform Committee. Julie was White House Deputy Chief of Staff during the Obama administration. And also we have Dennis McDonough, who served as the Chief of Staff in the Obama administration. So welcome. Also, Carmel Martin, my apologies, who serves as a senior advisor for policy on the Biden for President campaign and is the campaign's non-voting representative on our committee. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you the team who will be working with us throughout this process and was responsible for us having such a successful first meeting. And I trust that this one will be equally successful. Andrew Grossman is the platform director. He's also served as platform director in 2012 and 2016. Leah Moody is the deputy director and has over 2 decades of experience working with allied groups and elected officials. Patrice Taylor is the Director of Party Affairs at the DNC and is responsible for all of the party business that happens at the convention. Christina Costa and Maitan Shorev are the writers and will be working with each of you as they put together the proposed draft that we will review. Zeppa Krager is from the Biden campaign and serves as a liaison between the campaign, convention, and party. And Quinn Tran and Tabitha Schustock round out the platform team. Quinn was also a part of the platform team in 2016 and 2012. So we are ready to get started with the second Platform Drafting Committee virtual hearing focused on the policies that ensure we are building a more equitable future for all Americans. As president, we know that Joe Biden will have a comprehensive agenda focused on equal opportunity, equal rights, and equal justice for all in order to ensure we are building towards a more perfect union. Today, we will hear from 17 speakers who will share their input to address some of the most critical issues that we are facing. These virtual hearings are opportunities for the drafting committee members to hear from individuals who will share their personal experiences, thoughts, and ideas on what should be reflected in the platform that will govern our party for the next 4 years. In addition to the hearings, we have a robust digital engagement to invite Democrats to share their input through stories.demconvention.com. On this site, voters will be able to provide comments and even upload a video where they will tell us what they would like to see reflected in the platform. So in addition to what we learned during these hearings, we will also be informed by the comments we receive online. While we would normally be gathered in person for these meetings, we do want to note that these meetings are being live streamed on the Democratic National Convention's YouTube channel. On Monday, over 1,300 people watched the hearing. We're excited to know that Democrats are engaged in this process. So let's welcome Aswad Thomas. Mr. Thomas is the Managing Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Aswad Thomas, and I am a husband, a son, and an athlete. I am also a victim of gun violence, and I'm originally from Highland Park, Michigan. After becoming the first male in my family to graduate college, and just days before heading overseas to play professional basketball, I was shot during an attempted armed robbery at a convenience store in my neighborhood. The bullets tore through my back, inches away from my aorta and my spinal cord, and nearly took my life. That experience ended my basketball career and changed my life forever. I spent months in physical therapy and depression. After the shooting, my family and I were left on our own. We received no support, and I was released from the hospital back into the same community where I was shot. Despite contact with law enforcement, I was never directed to any victim services. During my last doctor's appointment, my doctor told me the story of a young person he treated 4 years prior. This patient was 14 years old when he got shot, resulted in him losing sight in his eye. As the doctor shared more details, I realized he was describing one of the young people who shot me. Something clicked. This teenager became a victim of violence and received no support. His unaddressed trauma resulted in further victimization, my own. That realization led me to commit my life to stopping the cycle of violence. I started thinking about my own family. My father, my brother, and my cousin was shot, yet none received support to recover. I started seeking out ways to make a difference, to stop people from experiencing my fate. The organization I work at today, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and started building their national program to bring victims of crime together to fix public safety policy. Today, I am the managing director of our Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice program, the largest national network of crime victims in the nation. We represent over 42,000 crime victims that have experienced all types of victimization, and a majority of whom come from communities most harmed by violence. There are a few critical learnings that my work with crime victims all across the country have revealed about our nation's approach to public safety. First, most victims of crime do not receive any help. Too many victims do not get compensation or help navigating the justice system or access to trauma recovery. Second, most victims of crime do not support tough on crime or mass incarceration policies. We've conducted representative surveys across the country and found that instead of tough incarceration, most victims want crime prevention, mental health, treatment, restorative justice, and public health investments. And third, victims of color are particularly harmed by the lack of support for victims. Black Americans that are victims of gun violence, kidnapping, domestic violence, and sexual assault are often too ignored and disregarded. The criminal justice system has failed us. Despite the $200 billion spent on policing in the criminal justice system each year, crime victims do not have safety or support. Our public safety priorities need to change. This platform committee can promote several important solutions, from trauma recovery, mental health, rehabilitation, and victim services. And importantly, reducing the billions wasted on over-incarceration. Replacing mass incarceration with shared safety. With safety for all is what communities need. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas, for that powerful testimonies. And so often in Black and Brown communities, especially, we don't even know to call it post-traumatic stress or anxiety. We just know it as anger and rage. So I appreciate your work. I will now recognize Senator Duckworth with the first question.
Thank you, Mayor. And I apologize to everyone. They've called votes on me, so I'm rushing back to the U.S. Capitol to cast my vote, which is why I'm in the car. Mr. Thomas, thank you for that very powerful statement. I want to give a shout out to Kim Fox from my own home state, who is fighting hard to bring fairness and safety to all communities, especially to our Black and Brown communities. Mr. Thomas, you touched on this, but I'd like for you to elaborate some more on the concrete steps that we can take to better reach at-risk youth who are growing up with trauma within our communities. You know, I go into the South Side of Chicago, and I see post-traumatic stress. And I've seen post-traumatic stress in the face of our wounded warriors coming home from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I see the same look in young people's eyes. You know, we need to do better to support in terms of support services, education, and community building. What type of programs should we be prioritizing with this committee as we seek to move away from incarceration towards prevention? Can you sort of give me maybe major baskets of things in terms of what can we do and what should we prioritize? Is it, you know, we're talking about community building, we're talking about education, we're talking about support services. I think it'd be important to be able to organize that in a cohesive way so that this platform committee can directly touch on those specific things as we write our platform. Thank you.
No, thank you. Great question. And what we need to do is we need to really invest in the infrastructure for trauma recovery. When I think about incarceration, we've took billions of dollars out of communities. Now it's time to reinvest billions of dollars back into communities for more drug treatment programs, for more trauma recovery centers. We know that for many victims of crime, from children to adults, do not access services in communities. And so if we're able to invest in the infrastructure that's needed to address trauma, that's needed to invest mental health support, that's needed to invest in the health and well-being of our community members in our community. And so if we're able to strategically invest in the infrastructure that's needed for trauma recovery centers, for communities in Chicago, for communities in Detroit, we need to invest in that infrastructure that's needed to help stop the cycles of crime. And so there are dozens of programs that are working. Many of the organizations in our network are often on the front lines to violence, are often providing wraparound services, but unfortunately, those organizations are often volunteer-based. Those organizations don't have the resources and capacity to meet the need of crime and violence and the mental health support that's needed in communities. So I would say we just need to invest in that infrastructure, and we have a great opportunity to do that by taking money out of the criminal justice system.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize State Senator Rodriguez for our next question.
Thank you, Mayor. Oswald Thomas, you and I met in Tallahassee when your organization, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, brought 400 crime survivors to Tallahassee. We here in Florida, criminal justice reform has been slow and modest, but what we have been able to accomplish, I want to give you all credit for the organizing work that goes into a lot of it. And I also want to, highlight the transformational work that you all do, putting individuals and communities that are most affected by crime trying to put them at the center of the conversation about how criminal justice resources are spent and on policy changes for criminal justice reform, but also, talking about healing as part of justice, right? So justice is punishment, but healing is also part of that. And I had a two-part question for you. In a lot of states, we face opposition from crime survivors when we're talking about reducing incarceration. And so the first question is to ask you to talk to us a little bit about how that conversation goes with crime survivors. And the second is, if you could, the second question related to that is, how do you make the connection between tackling mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline on the one hand, and cutting down violence in our communities on the other?
Hello, Senator Rodriguez, thank you for the question. It's always great to see you again. When working with crime victims, we have conducted representative surveys of victims of crime across the country. And what we found is that, like victims and like voters, victims support a wide range of criminal justice reforms that reduce incarceration, especially when we are given a choice about how to improve public safety. This isn't a debate about incarceration versus public safety. This is a debate about the best pathway to safety. When we are clear that we have choices about how to achieve safety and victims are given a chance to choose, we do not choose mass incarceration. We choose the opposite. And so, we focus on healing, and through our network and victims of crime across the country, here are examples of policies that majority of crime victims support that, leaders like you could champion. Shorter sentences for most people and more investments into crime prevention. Earn credit for rehabilitation so people serve shorter prison sentences and come out prepared for release. We need large-scale diversion into mental health for people with mental illness. We need to review sentences and release people that are elderly, medically frail, or have been assessed as low risk. We also need to eliminate money bail. The list goes on and on. All of these are popular when it's clear that A, this means a more balanced approach to safety with an emphasis on prevention and treatment, and B, there are mechanisms to review and evaluate public safety considerations. So victims of crime are untapped allies in this movement for criminal justice reform. The way to bring us in is to talk about safety and address our needs for healing and support. And that's by elevating the voice and experience of crime victims that are in those communities most harmed by violence. And to your second question, what we need to do is invest in the resources that are needed in communities. Often we see that young people that are victims of crime themselves, that may have been a victim of a violent crime, may have lost a parent or a loved one, may have been a victim of child sexual abuse. There isn't an infrastructure for those children to access support and services. And when you look at the criminal justice system, a lot of men and women that are incarcerated have been victims of a crime before they came in contact with the justice system. And so if we're able to, stop cycles of crime from happening and invest in the community-based solutions, then we will have a huge opportunity to make people safe and make our community safe, is what we all want.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas. We appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we will have pre-tape video testimony from Desmond Meade. Mr. Meade is the Executive Director and CEO of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And as with all of our attendees who are offering testimony via video testimony. If you have questions, please forward those questions to our staff, and we will be sure to get you answers to those questions. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Desmond Meade, and I'm the Executive Director of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. I'd like to first thank the DNC Platform Planning Committee for inviting me to submit this video testimony. Let me start with my story. In August of 2005, I found myself standing in front of railroad tracks in South Florida. At that time, I was homeless, I was addicted to drugs, and I was recently released from prison. I didn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and so I was ready to end my life. But God had other plans, and the train didn't come that day. So eventually I crossed the tracks, and I entered into a substance abuse treatment facility. After successfully completing the drug program, I moved into a homeless shelter, and while living there, I decided to go back to school. I enrolled at Miami-Dade College in this paralegal program, did extremely well, and continued my education by pursuing a bachelor's degree in public safety management with a concentration in criminal justice. After graduating with highest honors, I was eventually accepted into law school at Florida International University College of Law, where I graduated with a Juris Doctorate degree in May of 2014. Along my journey, I joined Florida Rights Restoration Coalition to eventually become its president and then its executive director. And it was my time with Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in which we were able to successfully pass the Amendment 4 Constitutional Initiative in the state of Florida in November of 2018. That was one of my proudest moments because we was able to re-enfranchise over 1.4 million Floridians with previous felony convictions. But I was also proud of the fact of how we accomplished that. And that was we was able to lead with love, that we was able to connect with people along the lines of humanity and bring people in from all walks of life, all political persuasions, in support of saying yes to Amendment 4. And that night when we passed Amendment 4, I told everyone that would listen that love had in fact won the day. Another important fact about Amendment 4 is the fact that talks about criminal justice reform, that talks about some of the conditions that ail our community and our country at that. And that is that the people who are closest to the pain must be a part of the solution. What does that mean? It means that as you're considering items to place on the platform for the DNC, that we must engage people who are closest to the pain, people who are directly impacted. When you talk about criminal justice reform, that means people like me. And we have similar individuals in several states across this country, whether it's in Louisiana, whether it's in North Carolina, California, or even Philadelphia, New York, that there are individuals who have personally gone through these trials with the criminal justice system that can help you or help to inform your decision-making process. I want to thank you for this opportunity once again, and I hope that you would include people directly impacted as you're going about creating this platform. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
All right. Now we will hear from Kim Fox, the Cook County State's Attorney. Attorney Fox, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Good evening. I have the honor and the privilege of serving as the Cook County State's Attorney in my birthplace of Chicago. I carry the distinction of being the first Black woman to hold this position, but just as importantly, I'm the first person to hold this position who hails from the Cabrini Green housing project. I make this distinction because the fact that I sit here, having been born in an environment that was emblematic of systemic and structural racism that infiltrated every aspect of our governmental institutions, is actually quite remarkable. The racist policies in housing, healthcare, education, economic disinvestment, and the criminal justice system were well at play in my childhood. The fact is that as a child of a teenage mother, living in public housing, myself a survivor of sexual abuse, and having had bouts of homelessness, I had every risk factor that you've heard about this afternoon that would lead me into the criminal justice system, just not as its top prosecutor. The reality is that for far too long, we've accepted jails and prisons as a depository for those who have been failed and targeted by racist approaches to our societal conditions. It is because of this that I believe that we must act with real intentionality and urgency to address criminal justice reform and enact meaningful legislation to repair the harm that has been caused by decades of failed policies. During my tenure as Cook County State's Attorney, I've worked to enact bail reform, for example, because the fact is most people languishing in our jails are not there because they're a threat to public safety, but rather they are simply poor. 75% of the people in Cook County Jail are Black. I stopped prosecuting people, for example, for failure to pay parking tickets and other what I would call ticky-tack fines that resulted in a suspension of their driver's licenses, disabling poor people from working and providing for their families. I fought for and won the passage of cannabis legalization in Illinois, which contained a provision, a first of its kind, which allowed for the automatic vacation and expungement of previous convictions for cannabis. It simply wasn't enough to legally profit from its sales while thousands of men and women, mostly men and women of color, were saddled with convictions and locked out of opportunities because of the collateral consequences of that conviction. The failed war on drugs and the carnage and devastation in its wake has been at the expense of poor Black and brown communities. We must work with a sense of urgency and heed the cries from the streets to repair this harm. Lastly, police accountability. It must be at the forefront of our efforts. I live in a county that is gripped by gun violence, while at the same time, the communities most impacted have the least amount of faith and trust in law enforcement. Cook County was once known as the false confession capital of the United States. Yet during my tenure, I've overturned the convictions of over 100 men and women, and the vast majority of those convictions were the result of a corrupt police sergeant who preyed upon people living in public housing. We cannot address violence in our communities when people who need to be protected feel preyed upon and targeted. By holding police accountable, it allows for legitimacy and credibility in our systems. I urge this committee to use the measures I've outlined as a template for the reforms that we've undertaken here in Cook County as a meaningful guideline for a criminal justice reform agenda. Again, I thank you for your time, and we'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Attorney Fox. It's an honor to hear from you. My father grew up in Cabrini Green, so thank you. We will now move on to questions, and our first question is from Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, Attorney Fox. Great to hear your testimony and your story. I very much appreciate that. I have a bit of a two-part question. My first question is really related to that last comment about the communities impacted by gun violence the most are really impacted with respect to trusting the law enforcement officials who are supposed to protect them. What kind of real world kind of now solutions do you propose for rebuilding that trust?
I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that broken trust is not the result of the community. I think too often we have this conversation where we have to say we have to meet each other in the middle. The reality is the systems that I've just described and the impact that it's had has been a result of the structures that have been put in place. And so when I talk about the fact that there are people who live in these neighborhoods who've seen police officers plant guns, plant drugs, treat them with disrespect, that is not, conditioned upon anything that they had done. So some of the real world things that we can do is invest in community building, invest in infrastructures within the community, whether it's the things that we've talked about, trauma recovery services or trauma informed services, educational services, restorative justice work. And when we talk about community policing, we're talking about constitutional policing, that we disabuse ourselves of the notion that police are occupying forces, but should be there to support the needs of community. But I think the first is to make sure that we have meaningful investments in community-based services and resources.
Thank you, Attorney Fox. My next question is, it seems that you've made significant progress in your role in Cook County. What have been some of the bigger challenges or hurdles that you've had to remove, and what still exists that inhibit you from doing your job successfully?
I think the biggest challenge is people being wedded to this notion of more police enforcement leads to safer outcomes. And I think what you've heard from the last two testimonies is that that is in fact not the case. The response to the violence that we're seeing in our communities is not necessarily, it's not necessary to meet it with a heavy hand. That if we really care about public safety, we don't have a choice of public safety or criminal justice reform. You must have criminal justice reform and legitimacy and credibility for people to be able to participate in the work that you do. So I think the biggest barriers have been, I will just say the police unions here have been incredibly resistant to justice reform and have been wedded to the old ways of law enforcement. So the ways that we've been able to get around that is having survivors of abuse or survivors of trauma come in and testify, impacted citizens come in and testify about how the system did more harm than help, and be able to educate our legislators about what the real needs are. By doing that, we've built coalitions that have been working on bail reform, on cannabis legalization, on revitalization efforts that have been broad. And as a result of that, we've been able to do things that might have seemed impossible here in Cook County just 4 years ago.
Thank you for your responses and your continued pioneering service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from President Trumka.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms. Kimberly, thank you for your testimony. And more importantly, though much more needs to be done in just a few short years, you've made tremendous progress with regard to criminal justice reform. And you are clearly the reformer that Chicago needs. Now, you've overcome a lot of resistance to make reforms happen in Chicago. So my question to you is whether there are any lessons or insights from your experience in Chicago that you could share with us about overcoming resistance to tackling structural and systematic racism, because we need to make sure that this is a movement and not just a moment at the national level.
Thank you for that question. I think the first thing is to tell the truth. I spoke about the fact that the issues that we were having in our justice system were as a result of systematic and structural racism. If we don't have hard conversations about what got us here, we will then have solutions that don't fit the problem. And tackling the fact that bond, for example, bail reform was disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities, that we were punishing people for poverty, got people to think and look, why is 3 out of 4 people in our jail coming from just 2 sections of our city? It's not accidental. So one, having hard conversations about race. I think we're right now in this movement, in this moment, where those conversations seems to be more readily available to have, that people are more willing to listen. And I thank the people out in the streets for elevating that. But you cannot do anything towards reconciliation until you get to truth. Second, I believe in data transparency. My office was the first prosecutor's office to put everything that we've done on an open data portal. So you can see the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you can see, not by anecdote, but by real facts, what racial disparities look like. And then you can have a tactical approach to addressing them. So being transparent about your work and then bringing in a coalition of people to work with you doing that. And you have to keep talking. The reason that I talk about where I come from is because a lot of people ask me, oh my God, how did you make it? How did you survive all of those things that I listed? And that is based on the supposition that people like me who come from those neighborhoods and have those challenges are supposed to fail. And because we've accepted failure, we've accepted those systems, we're losing so much talent that can really heal our world. I believe every day that we lose someone to gun violence on our street, that's the possible cure for COVID. Every day that we see someone locked in our jails is someone who's missing out on contributing. We have to believe that there's value in every member of our community and engage them as solution makers, bring them to the table to help guide policy. And I think that's how I've been so successful in the last 4 years.
May I just ask one other thing? From what I heard you say, you would agree, I guess, that we should not disengage and isolate, but we should rather engage and try to come to an accommodation and to try to reform that way by engaging?
We have to engage. I mean, I think we have to be clear about where our boundaries are. I think the moment right now calls for us to not hamper ourselves by seeking a moment where we're in total agreement. I think we've gotten this far by trying to be incremental and not offend too far on one way or the other. This is a real crisis moment for us. I think what we've seen in the era of mass incarceration is a real civil rights issue of our day. And so, yes, we want to bring as many people along, but we have to have a broad imagination about what's possible. The language that we're hearing around, defunding and reallocation of resources, that's all about reimagining what's possible and not accepting what has been done. And so with that imagination, we can bring people along, but I don't want us to get stuck into this won't work, this can't happen, we can't. That's how we've gotten just minor incremental changes, and the moment demands more.
Thank you for your incredible testimony. You've been most helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am inspired by your words and your work. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mayor.
Next, we have John Yang. He is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Yang.
Thank you very much. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. I appreciate this opportunity to testify before all of you, specifically on immigration challenges faced by the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, and how immigration must be part of this vision for a more equitable future. At the outset, it's important to note what the Asian American community is. Our community is the fastest growing community in the United States. We have grown by over 75% since the 2000 census. Within that community, over 60% of the Asian Americans are immigrants. Over 90% of our community are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. So when we talk about immigration policy, that has to be a fundamental part of how we look at Asian Americans and policies that affect our community. At the same time, there's different components that we have to consider. First and foremost is with respect to family visas and family immigration. Over 60% of our community came through using these different family visa categories. And so that's a bedrock principle for the Asian American community. At the same time, Asian immigrants also come in through all the different categories, whether as refugees and asylees, work visas, dreamers, TPS holders, holders of all types of temporary visas, and also undocumented individuals. So all of these immigration categories need to include an Asian face and policies that make sense for our community. So let me talk briefly about some of our priorities. First is family unity. Over 1.5 million Asians are stuck in backlogs related to family visa categories. Some of these backlogs are lasting for over 20 years. The Reuniting Families Act, sponsored by Representative Chu, is a strong starting point for the type of legislation that would address these issues. More generally, policies that we see that separate families or that somehow consider certain family members more valuable or more merit-worthy than others are non-starters for us. For us, the notion of a merit-based system that elevates certain categories and devalues others does not work. It does not make sense to talk about grandparents and not have them be valued when they are taking care of grandkids so both parents can work, or not to value siblings who are trying to expand a family business. So we have to talk about all of these initiatives, including public charge, including the ban on fee waivers for citizenship applications that are gutting the immigration system and gutting what it means to bring people over into the United States. I know others will talk about DACA. A couple of other things I would highlight. One is the Muslim ban, and that's another executive order that has to be rescinded immediately. The Asian community knows too well what these types of national and economic security elements have caused to our community. These include the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Japanese incarceration during World War II, post 9/11 racial profiling of the Memza, or the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American communities. The Muslim ban is no different than any of that. And finally, I would address the criminalization of certain elements of the immigrant community. Too much money has been spent on incarceration and criminalization of immigrants, and too many immigrants are being deported because of past convictions for which they have already served their time, past convictions that are really part of that ticky-tack type of criminal convictions that the mayor previously spoke of. What we need is an immigration system that embraces all of the community and not simply elevates certain classes and certain wealth to others. There's been a fire that's been created in our House on immigration because of this current administration policies. Even if that fire is put out with a new administration, so much work has to be done to repair the damage that has been done to our House. And so this next administration has to work hard on all these policies, both immediate and long-term, to make sure that our House is put back in order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our first question is from Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Yang, for your powerful testimony. I think you raise very important issues. As you know, we in the Democratic Party agree that our immigration system is broken and that there's a need for modernization that includes the type of change that, while protecting our security, will actually lead to a more fair and humane system that preserves the dignity of immigrant families, refugees, and asylum seekers. I understand that for a lot of immigrant youth, especially Southeast Asian Americans who came here as refugees and do not become naturalized, the school-to-prison pipeline could end in deportation and being separated from their families. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. That's an important component. There's two aspects of that. First is recognizing the different pathways to citizenship, even within the Asian American community. So for Southeast Asian Americans, most came here as refugees. Unfortunately, when they came here as refugees, there was not the infrastructure or resources provided to that community so that that community could be set up for success. As a result, many as youth ended up in gangs or ended up in these types with these types of petty criminal convictions. Right now, we are looking at about 16,000 Southeast Asian Americans that have final orders for deportation. About 14,000 of them have criminal convictions from a long time ago. And that criminal conviction is forming the basis for that deportation. That doesn't make any sense because these individuals are people that have contributed to society, contributed to America in significant ways, and have already atoned for the sins, so to speak, of their past, and should be given that opportunity to really grow up and fulfill that American dream. For all of these people, it really is the only country that they've ever known. And the notion of sending them, quote unquote, back to their home country makes no sense.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next question is from Congresswoman Lee. And Congresswoman, can you unmute yourself? No, you're still muted.
Okay.
Okay.
Am I unmuted now? Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Also, let me thank all of our witnesses today. And Mr. Yang, really, really good to see you. And thank you so much for being here and for your consistent work over the years. Wanted to ask you one question as it relates to the diverse nature of the AAPI community, which you laid out in your testimony. As you know, I co-chair the Health Task Force for KPAC. And one of the issues that we've been fighting for is data disaggregation. Wanted to discuss the importance of ensuring that all communities within the AAPI community are spoken for, and how could having a disaggregated data contribute to much better immigration policies?
Thank you very, very much for that question, Representative Lee, and it's good to see you again. Absolutely, with respect to data disaggregation. So what this means, just so everyone is clear, is making sure that we don't treat the Asian American community as a lump, as some sort of monolith. The reality is we represent over 50 different nationalities, over 100 different languages. And even with respect to the previous question, that was part of it, is that the Southeast Asian American community has different needs than, if you will, the East Asian, the Korean, Japanese, Chinese American community. And that those needs also look differently with respect to immigration than Indian Americans. So making sure we have robust data disaggregation that addresses all of these different communities is critical to what we do. Frankly, we're very close to getting to that finish line under the Obama administration. There were rules that in place that was before the OMB to set out a new, more robust version of data disaggregation so that we could really address all of these nuances within not only the Asian American community, but all of the different communities, including a new category for what's called MENA, the Middle Eastern North African category, to address that community and making sure that they are distinct. Unfortunately, we didn't get over the finish line or through the finish line. The hope is that that could be part of this platform and part of this new administration's efforts to really understand our community, because this is about understanding our American community as a whole.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Yang.
Thank you.
We will have testimony from Leoria Pena. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She serves as a pro bono counsel at the American Bar Association.
Thank you. Yes, and it's Laura Pena. It's a pleasure to be here. And even though I do serve as counsel of the ABA, I do want to say that I am stating this in my personal capacity as an immigration attorney, an advocate on the border. Over the last 4 years, the ground that was immigration law has become a sinkhole. The border walls forcibly erected in my home region not only destroy the fabric of our binational communities, but they stand as a cold, physical reminder of Trump's inhumane policies. Policies that have left women, children, and vulnerable migrants to be raped, assaulted, and extorted while forced to wait their immigration hearings in dangerous Mexican border towns. Policies that have shuttered the United States to entire populations based on xenophobia and fear-mongering, and policies that have torn families apart with irreparable and traumatic harm tantamount to torture. But today's session is not about the past, and it's not about the present. It is about the future. Today, I challenge the Platform Committee to re-envision the Democrats' commitment to immigrants in America, to go beyond one section of the platform, which in 2016 advocated for comprehensive immigration reform, an end to family detention, a call to support dreamers and their parents, all of these things necessary, but woefully inadequate given this historical moment. Today, more Americans than ever are coming to terms with the institutionalized racism in policing and mass incarceration. The Black Lives Matter movement has sparked calls for an end to injustice against Black Americans. Together, the Me Too movement, the demand for LGBTQ plus equality, and the inspiration of dreamers, all of these movements for social justice must be the lens through which we view immigration. I am a former ICE prosecutor under the Obama administration. It is through that eye-opening experience that I come to the committee asking you to consider what some may consider a radical proposal: an end to civil immigration detention. A call to end the paradigm of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. Families, not felons, has a nice ring to it, but it makes for unjust and cruel policy that separates families. When you consider the commitment to end mass incarceration as part of criminal justice reform, which the earlier witnesses were speaking of, know that nearly every year, 500,000 immigrants are jailed for immigration-related offenses. So a commitment to end mass incarceration must require an end, or at least a major curbing, of civil immigration imprisonment. When the Platform Committee considers guaranteeing women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and affirming the Violence Against Women Act, I challenge you to call for enshrining gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity as a protected ground for seeking asylum. Or when you consider protecting essential workers and creating good jobs, I beg you to speak out against immigrant workers having to choose between an unsafe work environment and the threat of deportation. And when you consider restoring our place in the world as a beacon of freedom, remember that freedom within our borders is not a current reality for 11 million living in the shadows. As thousands across the nation march to chants of say his name and say her name, I say, Carlos Hernandez Vasquez, Guatemalan, 16 years old. Wilmer Josue Ramirez Vasquez, Guatemalan, 2 years old. Felipe Alonso Gomez, Guatemalan, 2 years old. Jacqueline Ami Calmaquin, Guatemalan, 7 years old. Roxana Hernandez Rodriguez, Honduran, 33-year-old trans woman. All of these souls needlessly died of preventable illnesses while in immigration jails simply for seeking protection in the United States. You have the opportunity to show the world the Democrats are for freedom and empowerment of all people. I hope you take on the institutional challenges that bring us together during this unique moment in history. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for calling their names, and thank you for your testimony. President Applebaum has the first question. Mr. President, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ms. Pena, for your work and for your passionate testimony. Immigrants are a vital part of our nation's workforce. Many of our country's essential workers are immigrants. They kept society functioning, even as they put themselves at risk, and they deserve our gratitude. They need to be valued. I'd like to ask you, what policies can we implement that would protect the valuable contributions that immigrant workers provide our economy, and more importantly, protect those workers themselves? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the statement and the question. And you're absolutely right. The earlier witness, Mr. Yang, he actually spoke very well about some of these, or about the way to acquire citizenship. And right now, U.S. immigration structure, the only way you can seek citizenship is through a job or through family. And so re-envisioning what that infrastructure looks like, what that system looks like, how you can gain that path to citizenship is critical to ensure the workers who are here and are not on either path, right? Not through their employers, right? Their employers are, many of them, especially in the meat plants right now during this crisis, are being required to work in unsafe environments. And honestly, they're choosing between an option of possible death at working or death at being deported, because many of them fled dangerous environments. So there has to be an opening of what it means to be an American citizen and how to get to that path. There are a lot of temporary possible fixes as well, which also Mr. Yang mentioned, but those would be temporary work authorizations to cover a number of essential workers, particularly during this time, would be critical and would be a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Garcia with the next question.
Thank you so much. And Laura, it's good to see you. And you proposed a great challenge, and I for one will accept that challenge and join with you. Just last week with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we did a CODEL and went to visit two of the detention centers in South Texas, in Pearsall and Dilley. And it's still amazing to me that they don't seem to get any better. They just seem to be getting worse from the first time I visited a detention center back when I was a state senator. So I probably have visited, 14, 15 different detention centers around mostly Texas and one in New Mexico, where one of the the names that you mentioned, the young girl died. When you talk about reimagining what we do with detention, and I agree with you, we've criminalized immigration. I agree with Mr. Yang. What is it that you think we can do to make improvements and to change the system? Because it's set up for detention right now, and especially the most horrible ones are the private facilities. So what do you envision that we need to be doing to stop this imprisonment? Because they're jails, and the ones that have children, I call them baby jails, and they need to be stopped. How do we get there, and what is it that you propose that we put in this platform?
Thank you, Congresswoman Garcia, and thank you for your leadership. I know it's been a long time here in Texas, and we're so proud to have you in Washington. Let's start with just asylum seekers, and that's just one category. Under the law right now, individuals who present at the port of entry to lawfully seek asylum, it's mandatory detention. There is no reason asylum seekers should be subjected to mandatory detention. Under the Obama administration, there were several programs called Alternatives to Detention, which did not require detention and which, provided it was highly efficient and highly effective in terms of individuals appearing for their immigration hearings. Unlike the criminal justice system, the immigration system, it's not intended to penalize. Right? That's not the purpose of detention. It's merely to ensure that individuals are going to appear at their court hearings and to ensure that they're not a danger to the community. Once that danger assessment has been completed, individuals should not be detained. And so in the asylum context, I would say that it requires creating a separate component, a separate agency that is similar to USCIS or within USCIS that removes the law enforcement element, the imprisonment element for asylum seekers. And having that distinguished, it's a model in other countries, would be one step, at least in the right direction, particularly for the families that you visited in the family detention centers who are fleeing persecution in the home country. So that would be one suggestion to go in the right direction.
Well, thank you, and keep up the great work, and let's visit some more before our platform is finalized. Thank you.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Next, we will hear from Hamse Warfa, who serves as a Deputy Commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. He's also an author and an entrepreneur.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, and my co-panelists, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify and include my perspective on this wonderful platform that you are putting together. My family came to the United States in 1994 as Muslim Black refugees from Somalia. Before the Somalia Civil War, my parents were very successful entrepreneurs themselves. And so when the war happened in 1991, we came to Kenya and spent 3.5 years in refugee camps where we became non-existent. We had a number that we would only collect food and water. So our identity has been reduced to a statistical number. From there, when we came to the United States, my family and I were beneficiaries of the U.S. The public benefit program, including affordable housing, welfare, and other benefits, and which allowed me to really rebuild my life, and now gave me the opportunity to have access to the marketplace. As a founder of 2 successful businesses, including a software company that now operates in 24 countries. And my commitment has been for the last 20 years to ensure that ownership of identity, ownership of our economy, and ownership of our political lives are my passion and what I want to continue doing in life. And what I am most grateful is the opportunity really for people like myself to come to the US for one primary reason, and that is in search of opportunity to rebuild our lives. Unfortunately today, and very sadly, people like myself as a Muslim refugee are banned from coming to the United States. And I have family members who are now not allowed to visit and come to the United States because simply who they pray to, or the circumstances beyond their control that they found themselves in a civil war, fleeing from violence and persecution, or from climate crisis. And so I'm really an advocate and feel strongly that the next administration will put one particular component of the immigration, and that is the refugee resettlement program. This is a program that was established in 1980s, and it has always maintained bipartisan support. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And my goal is that we build a platform that is inclusive of everybody. Inclusion means we all benefit from it. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you for your testimony. Our first question is from Congresswoman Lee. Congresswoman, unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me thank you, first of all, for being with us today, and wanted to see, given your experience coming from refugee resettlement and now doing these great things in your community, how do you see building a more equitable economy and investing in a more equitable economy for businesses and for minority-owned businesses, for immigrant-owned businesses? What do we need to know to make sure that we have those mechanisms and tools in place for small minority-owned, women-owned, immigrant-owned businesses?
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. The reason I joined Minnesota state government was really to help bring new approach to government in terms of service delivery, and to bring critical and needed reform. And one of the things that I'm learning, especially since COVID has happened, which really brought to the surface the needs of refugees and immigrants who really come with a strong entrepreneurial spirit, is that our economy depends on the contributions of refugees and immigrants. When they are fully prepared for today's workforce needs, and when they are fully prepared to be given the opportunities to invest in their businesses. Most of the communities of color, whether immigrant, refugees, and Black community, highly underinvested, highly lacks access to credits. And so one of the critical things is, to really look equity in a way that is inclusive of both economic development and workforce development, and look in those two critical aspects as growing our economy, and not really just rebuilding the economy before COVID-19, but building a new economy that is inclusive of all. We have systems and institutions that were built and meant to be exclusive of many communities. And the opportunity now that we have post-COVID is to rebuild an economy and build a new economy that is really an inclusive of people that are demographically different, people who live on the margins of our economy, people who never really had the chance, who were never part of the economy before COVID-19. And so my strong recommendation for policy is to, number one, ending the Muslim ban, and number two, instituting increasing and admitting refugees back to the United States, and number three, providing access to capital and modernizing our workforce system, and so that we have opportunities for people who are not currently on the workforce participation. And one of the reasons is because we have workforce adjacent issues that are barriers to people thriving. Those are housing issues, those are criminal justice reform issues. These are, people who don't really feel they're part of their communities. They are not hopeful about their future. And what we can do together is to build that one America that we all deserve.
So you're talking about removing the barriers and then investing in an economy that has equity as a lens that's central to the new policies and programs.
Exactly, and not equity as a set aside project, but equity that is embedded in the operations, in the processes, in the policies, and quite frankly, a significant change culturally to include everybody in our economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Secretary Vilsack.
Thanks, Mayor. I want to thank you very much for a compelling testimony, but as importantly for your public service and the work that you're doing in terms of workforce development there in Minnesota. I think it's an incredibly important job that you're doing. And you've obviously brought an entrepreneurial spirit to that job. When I was governor of Iowa, we established a thing called New Iowan Centers, where we had facilities across the state that were designed to welcome new folks into our state, to give them information about job opportunities, about housing, about educational opportunities for their children in languages, in multiple languages, trying to create a sense of community. So I'm interested in the work that you're currently doing in Minnesota, the work that you are engaged in, and what kind of challenges you currently see that immigrants and refugees in Minnesota and the Midwest are facing, and how some of the innovative policies that you're incorporating in Minnesota might be able to address those challenges and barriers.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. One thing that we just launched recently is we're one of 40 states in the country now that created the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. This office is dedicated fully to remove barriers that exist in state governments. And so one of the things that we are, identifying, and also I have identified as I travel across the state, is, adjacent issues to workforce and economic development. Transportation. We know that 1/3 of people cannot go to work precisely because they don't have means to get to work. So transportation is a key barrier. Secondly, linguistic and culturally relevant services plays an important role in accessing and removing barriers. More importantly, I will say that finding credential, many refugees and immigrants come to the United States with significant educational accomplishments, but yet they do not really get the opportunity to bring their educational background and experiences for the benefit of their new country. We know medical doctors and others who are Uber drivers now because their licensing are not really recognized. So credential and licensure recognition is a critical need, especially in a COVID world where we're lacking a lot of healthcare providers. It becomes more necessary that we connect the needs of our employers and our people with the skill sets that refugees and immigrants bring to this country. One thing that I would like to highlight briefly is that when my family came to Kenya, fleeing from the war, we lost all of our identity. So the 20 years of entrepreneurial history that my father had, who passed away when I was 13 years old, my mother, who was a very successful businesswoman, we have a reset button on our head. Every time we move from one country to another, the reset button is hit. And so when people come to the United States, they restart life from all over again. So losing 20 years, 30 years of your life, restarting from scratch is a critical barrier. And so if there's one thing that we can do in the United States is dignity through identity, providing the digital history and identity, including transaction-based identity, including people who get loans while they're in the refugee camp and they pay back 17 different loans, but yet when they come to the United States, they cannot even rent an apartment because they don't have credit history. And so those are really critical barriers that are preventing a lot of people from benefiting the prosperity of our country.
Well, thank you very much for that incredibly insightful testimony today. I sincerely hope that that helps to inform this platform to address many of the barriers you have identified. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for joining us. I'd now like to recognize Ilsa Cruz. Ms. Cruz is a member of the Florida Immigrant Coalition.
Hello, my name is Ilse Cruz. I'm from a small town in Honduras. In Honduras, gang violence affects communities that have been traditionally marginalized. At the age of 6, I witnessed my father's murder right on my front porch. Gang members came by to collect the neighborhood taxes, and unfortunately, my father came up short. 4 gunshots later, and I found myself fatherless. My mother and I were now targets for the gang members, and we had no choice but to flee for our safety. After several unsuccessful visa applications due to our inability to open a bank account because we were extremely poor, we decided to do the impossible. We would risk our lives and cross the border to freedom. To my surprise, the land of the free was less than welcoming. Being an undocumented child forced me to hide in the shadows, and I was fraught with its challenges. I felt as if I was drowning all over again, just as when I crossed the border. I knew that I never wanted anyone else to feel the fear that had blanketed my childhood. This is how I became an activist for immigrants like me. I am grateful for Florida Immigrant Coalition for fighting for the things such as in-state tuition and for license for undocumented people in the state of Florida. Receiving DACA and my mother having TPS has helped us come out of the shadows, but it is only a band-aid over how broken the immigration system is in the United States. We need a path to citizenship. We need to hold our senators and Congress people accountable to not give up on immigration policies. Every 2 years, I have to renew my driver license and my DACA status. I have been in this country for 20 years, and I have been attending school, paying taxes, working hard. Dreamers like me still have their life in current administration. The current administration is putting our lives in so much fear. In closing, there are other children that are in similar situations as me that need to help seek asylum, fleeing from violence in their country. I urge you all to continue to have conversations on platforms such as today's topics to gain more understanding to how immigration system is broken and why we need a path to citizenship. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for your bravery and your advocacy. It's an honor to have you join us. Our first question is from State Senator Rodriguez.
Ilse, thank you for that. It's good to see you again, albeit virtually here. And thank you for your advocacy. It's an honor to rely on and know so many admirable dreamers here in Florida. So thank you for telling your story, for stepping up and stepping out and telling it. One of the things that unites us here is that restoring the soul of our country includes comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship. And recently we had a major victory at the US Supreme Court protecting DACA. And as a dreamer, that victory belongs to you. So congratulations to you. But based on the decision, we only won it because Trump is not just racist and cruel, but also incompetent. And that fact highlights the need to include protections for dreamers in comprehensive immigration reform. So the question that I have is, how should DACA's provisions be expanded upon as part of comprehensive immigration reform?
Can you word your question a little bit more so I can understand it?
Absolutely. So I'm just asking, there's a lot of hoops to jump through for DACA. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. It doesn't protect all dreamers. It's a specific program. So in your experience, how could we take the provisions of DACA and expand on it as we're advocating for immigration reform in Congress?
Yeah. I think also we need to think about our parents. My mother is a TPS recipient, and so I was able to fly because of my mother, you know, and I don't think it's fair for only DACA recipients to be put on a path to citizenship when we also have TPS holders and those 11 undocumented immigrants. And so if we can include those people, if we can put those people on a path to citizenship, because most of TPS recipients are parents, business owners, homeowners. And so we really need to shine the light on those people as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Gottney has our next question.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ms. Cruz, for your testimony and for your activism. And I'm sorry for your family tragedy and for how you've been treated. Can you walk us through some of the specific challenges that you and other of your other activists who you've been working with, challenges that you have faced as a result of the conservative attacks on DACA and on immigrants in general? I imagine that this has been at times terrifying. And so I think it would be really helpful for us to hear of those challenges.
Yes. So when I graduated high school, I graduated as class valedictorian, and I just remember thinking that I was undocumented at the time, and a lot of people were against me because of my status. Once I got to Broward Community College, I was choosing my classes for my first semester, and I just remember that the counselor, instead of choosing classes with me, she decided to tell me that I should go back to my country because I was not going to make it in America. It felt like I was getting discouraged, but I learned that a part of living the pursuit of happiness, just like how it is in the Declaration of Independence, I learned that that is something that we had to go through in order to have perseverance, and that had to build me up to be the woman of character that I am today. And so it's just little details that keep you discouraged, whether it's not being able to vote. I can't vote, but I urge you all to please vote. I know that former vice president mentioned that when he gets into office, his first day, he will send to Congress a bill that puts us DACA recipients and TPS holders on a path to citizenship. And so if we can vote in this election, please do it. I can't vote. You guys are my vote. And so I would really appreciate it if you guys could do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Allen also has a question.
Madam Chair, it's not as much a question. I just wanted to say to Ms. Cruz, I'm the president of Delaware State University, and we are proud to have 200 Dreamers, the first cohort of which graduated this spring. And I can tell you, I don't know a more active group of students who not only are advocating for themselves and their families, but are also excelling in the classroom. So I just wanted to say thank you for advocating for yourself, and know that folks like Delaware State and me are very much in support, and we'll take any dreamer that comes our way and make sure they feel at home. So thank you for all you're doing, and keep doing it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I might apply to law school there, so who knows?
Send me a direct email. We'll see what we can make happen.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You've got a lot of witnesses too, so we're going to hold you to that, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you just for just being so passionate and continuing to keep your head up and being encouraged. That is so important for all of us to remember, and I'll think of you when I go and vote. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Alejandrina Guzman. I'm sorry. I think that's, I'm sorry, Andy, you're going to have to give me the bio. I think we're a little out of order here. So can you please give me Ms. Guzman's bio? Serves as the People with Disabilities constituency organizer at the Texas Democratic Party. My apologies.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lina Guzman. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here. The disability community is not a monolith. Within our community, there are several communities. Being disabled is not just an identity, it means having shared lived experiences, and it is a culture. My testimony doesn't even dive into disability topics like making organizing inclusive, ensuring that polling locations are open and accessible for disabled people to cast the private ballots, and changing laws for marriage and wage equity, and enforcing established legislations like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Olmstead Act of 1999. We are currently in the middle of a global pandemic and uprisings across the nation. So I'll focus on some key points regarding infrastructure and systemic failures. When elected officials first began broadcasting emergency announcements and press briefings, the deaf and hard of hearing community was often left out because there were no ASL interpreters. COVID-19 infections began. People with underlying conditions, meaning people with disabilities, have been disproportionately affected. Indigenous, Black, and Latinx disabled people. Disabled people began scrambling due to the lack of attendants available because attendants began getting sick or were helping multiple people. This caused disabled people having days where they couldn't get out of bed because attendants were sick and state agencies couldn't provide backup attendants. Implementation of social distancing measures began. Both people with disabilities and attendants don't have that luxury, considering that many still lack personal protective equipment. Without PPE, we're not even safe in our own place of residence. Content warning, ableism, and murder. Due to lack of leadership, the pandemic is exponentially worsening. Several state disability rights organizations filed complaints to ensure that discrimination against disabled people in medical triage is prohibited. Currently in Texas, my own state, hospitals are over capacity. It's been 86 days since disabled activists and organizations sent a letter urging elected officials and the governor to establish policies to prohibit such discrimination against us. In addition to medical triage, our quality of life is being determined at will. In Austin, on June 11th, Michael Hickson died due to deprivation of treatment and food for 6 days because he was not deemed with quality of life. As uprisings continue, we must not forget why the demand for justice continues. Half of people killed by police are disabled, especially Black disabled people. Alicia Thomas, mental illness, 2014. Sandra Bland, epilepsy and depression, 2015. Elijah McClain, immunocompromised, 2019. George Floyd, heart condition, 2020. I'm one disabled person, a non-Black person of color, with the mic on to speak to all of you. And I admit that even I don't have all the answers. My community of disabled siblings, especially my disabled siblings who are Black, Indigenous, trans, poor, unhoused, undocumented, living in rural areas, incarcerated, in detention centers, in nursing homes. We have been out here fighting for our rights, actively using our imagination as we demand change. My community is suffering. My community is dying. Disabled people have been dying. Disabled people are being killed. Ableism kills. Ableism upholds white supremacy. We must actively be anti-ableist through the way we talk and interact with others, through policies and laws, and through protests and direct actions. Disability justice means Black lives matter. Black disabled lives matter. Disability justice means disabled, not disposable. Disability justice means abolishing institutions of policing, including ICE. Disability justice means liberation for all. I don't want kindness. I don't want empathy. I need people to get angry and raise hell alongside me and my disabled siblings. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question is from Mr. Orton. Mr. Orton, can you unmute yourself?
Sure thing. Thank you, Alejandrina, for providing us with your testimony today and sharing your experience and voice. You know, I've heard it said before that the COVID pandemic has created sort of a barium dye test of all of our society's institutions, from healthcare to employment to any other number of social services and structures. And I think it's striking, obviously, how much even before the pandemic, those in the disability community were already fighting against this flawed institutional system. And I wonder what do you think we can learn about the needs and protecting and advancing the rights of disabled people going forward? And if you could talk a little bit about, just generally, what you'd like to see in a platform of a Democratic president in order to make sure that we're all fighting for disabled people to be able to live within their community and to have health care no matter what.
Thank you so much for that question. The biggest things first is I would encourage people to Google, it's called #disability-demands, and a lot of national disability rights organizations and disabled activists have put a running list of current legislations they're pushing for and ideas for the presidency to implement. For now, I will talk about two main things. One is having more funding for home and community-based services. So that means not having disabled people live in institutions. Currently with the pandemic, it is estimated around 40% of people that have died were in nursing homes. And that, as we know, is a big population of disabled people. So more funding for HCBS. And the second point is this is more of an action call than an idea. I would hope to see that people creating, y'all creating the platform and, in the presidential run, creating policies to call for disabled people to the table and not just having them at the table, but giving them the mic because they know what's best. And there are so many issues that I can't even cover right now in the few minutes we have together, but a lot of issues do stem locally. So making sure that even local leaders are reaching out to disabled activists, leaders, and advocates.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Graves has our next question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Alejandrina, thank you very much for raising these really important issues. You have a very unique background, having been the first Latina student body president at University of Texas and the first student body president with a physical disability in the entire Big 12. During your time at UT, you were a strong proponent of the establishment of a sanctuary council for undocumented immigrants. What were some of the challenges you encountered in this process? And importantly, can you share how we might learn from that experience, your experience in navigating that world as we think about ensuring justice for all, including Black and Brown people and for those with disabilities?
Thank you. Question. So I'll acknowledge first that I have learned a lot since 2017, 2018, which was my term year, and a lot of things that I navigated in terms of bureaucratic systems and crossing red tape, so to say. I'm applying a lot of those lessons learned currently, but during my time for undocumented students, all I did was provide the mic for undocumented students and activists that were on campus. When 45 started doing everything against undocumented people, I immediately had a meeting with the same undocumented student activists and student leaders. And the plan of action was to create an underground mutual aid system, because we learned with my title being student body president, I had the knowledge that even if we had, like, for example, a Google Doc running of, names of undocumented students asking for example, items like food or deodorant or rent money, for example, we knew that even if we had that, if ICE were to go to campus, UT would enforce us to turn over that list. So we were very keen to being like, okay, we understand we can't have any record of this. And so again, it was just providing that platform and mic for undocumented students to lead the way. The second piece to that was having a meeting with the then university president and bringing all those students almost unannounced. And that was a key strategy that we used throughout our term, is knowing that by me having simply the title, I had access to so many resources and administrators. So all I had to do was call up the students and then email the administrators and say, hello, we want a meeting this and this day, this time. And then we show up and unannounced have a lot of leaders there and activists. So two things is amplifying and giving the mic and platform for the people that are affected, and two, navigating institutional systems, ensuring that while we do that, we are not accidentally hurting them.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your joining us today. Our next speaker is President Shannon Holsey of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Perez, Mayor Bottoms, and members of the Platform Committee. I want to thank you for that opportunity today, and thank you for the previous speaker. She was amazing, and I appreciate her tenacity and her recognition of the inclusivity of all. Today, I sort of want to briefly expound on the issue of relationship as it relates to equity in the United States and the longstanding relationship that the tribal nations, in particular my tribal nation, has had. As you may or may not know, there are currently 574 recognized tribal nations within the United States, and we are rich in our geographic, political, and cultural diversities. We are members of the original family of American governments and have a very unique legal and political relationship as the United States, as defined with specifically the Constitution, the treaties, the statutes, and the court decisions and executive orders. This relationship is shaped by the federal trust responsibilities. We are otherwise known as the trustee, a relationship that has been forced upon us through the acquisition of our land and our resources, and ultimately created a fiduciary responsibility relationship with the tribal nations, whereby recognizing a trust relationship to safeguard tribal rights, lands, and resources. Despite this obligation, and particularly during the present administration, the U.S. has generally failed to meet its trust responsibilities in a wide variety of areas, from things like healthcare, housing, education, child welfare, social services, and protection of resources. This breach of trust resulted in a 21st century health and socioeconomic crisis in Indian country, and quite honestly, as we look around this entire country. In particularly, it created significant disparity that led to the American Indian and Alaskan Natives vulnerability, specifically to the current pandemic of COVID-19, that resulted significantly in having the highest per capita COVID infection rate in the United States. Indian country is in a crisis, and really today what we are doing is we're looking for the DNC to address not only the present conditions, but the systemic and structural inequalities that have been imposed on our peoples at the expense of our lives and our livelihoods. And we need to move beyond surviving to thriving. Perhaps the most pressing issue right now in Indian country is the invisibility of our people. Native people are not only invisible in society, but also in data and in policy, which in turn must be informed by accurate, reliable, and timely data. As a result, the American Indian and Alaska Native people tend to be limited or even non-existent, further evidenced by a recent survey from Reclaiming Truth, the Native Truth Project, which was funded by the Kellogg Foundation, which found that 40% of Americans thought that American Indian and Alaska Native people no longer exist. And although the storybook depicts the story of the last Mohicans, and although I may not be the first Mohican, I am certainly not the last. And I am certain that there is clearly education that needs to be required. Data used for policy often includes or cannot separate American Indian people. We do know that even with imperfect measures, it is American Indians and Alaskan people that are much worse off in many ways than the rest of the US population and other racial ethnic groups. Often our population is viewed as just another racial or ethnic group within the United States, not as the indigenous people that we are, or our unique history and legal status. While ancestry is often a determining factor for other non-Native groups, because American Indians and Alaskan Natives people are indigenous, there is a host of historical, legal, and political factors besides ancestry to consider. I would strongly encourage the committee and others to read the Broken Promises report, which basically documents the challenges facing Indian country, specifically around poverty and violence rates in our communities that are at a higher, much proportionate rate than the national average. Other indicators of well-being, such as infant mortality and substance abuse, are also higher than the rest of America. Addressing these challenges requires strategy which demonstrates respect for tribal sovereignty and employs a collaborative approach to providing services to funding to Indian country. As the Broken Promises report indicates, it has been difficult for federal funding to keep up with these challenges and much less track the growth in annual inflation, especially understanding the unmet obligations. It also requires us to redefine the relationship with the federal government as our trustee, so that we can be more closely aligned and create a platform of parity with how they deal with their relationship of foreign relations or sovereigns. It needs to be more aligned with the redress of domestic sovereigns, Native Americans, to make this process that allows for both a need for reconciliation and consent around the decisions that are made on our behalf, and to be guided by inclusive, diverse, and accurate processes to guide the decision makers from a policy perspective. As the Broken Promises report demonstrates, much remains to be done to improve the economic and social well-being of Native Americans. Indian Affairs is establishing available resources to meet those challenges, but it's certainly not enough. And I'm hoping in the years ahead and with a new administration, we will continue to advance the needs of these efforts and others. And to order to assist the new administration, I've also provided a resolution that was stated from the National Congress of American Indians, which is the longest standing Indian country institute that provides a tribal platform with regards to some of the issues that we need to. In the spirit of brevity, I'll certainly just touch upon them. It exists, the government-to-government relationship, as previously mentioned, and the political relationship, and also making sure that there is an effectuation of inherent authority and jurisdiction as it relates to those trust and treaty responsibilities. Also, we also must continue to find ways to align and consult with tribal nations on a government-to-government basis to make sure that we obtain the free, prior, and informed consent when developing federal policies that affect us. And in turn, making sure those goals are aligned with the planning and management that needs to be from a both resource legislative initiative, but also from a land and resource management accountability system. Also, again, as I said, that our trustee relationship and their fiducial responsibility to not only tribal nations, it should not entail a paternalistic control over the day-to-day affairs of tribal nations or our citizens, but should be further self-determined policy based on partnership that ensures tribal nations have the necessary authority and resources to exist as distinct, self-governing peoples while protecting and maintaining and preserving our tribal resources and serving our citizens. Finally, tribal nations pre-exist the United States, and except where expressly ceded, they retain their inherent authority to self-govern. Support for tribal governance and authority is critical to the federal government's trust responsibilities. Accordingly, the federal government must work with tribal nations to strengthen and secure full civil and criminal authority and regulatory over our tribal nations, lands, resources, and people. Tribal nations should also have the opportunity and the right to assume regulatory and program management from federal programs with federal funding and support. Additionally, tribal nations must be eligible for all federal grants and aid provided to state and local governments. We are not sub-sovereigns. Moreover, the federal government must encourage, facilitate, and participate in policymaking. We advocate for achieving political equality through a platform of diversity and inclusion, much needed social and judicial reform, and recognize the result of this unique political relationship with the United States. Indian country should be an integral part of the DNC's national platform. It also requires the opportunity for us to redefine the relationship with the federal government as our trustee, so we are able to more closely align and create a platform of parity more aligned with the relationship that allows for that reconciliation. Also, we need, and I want to clearly demonstrate too, the need for representation, because as previously stated by Chair Perez and others, representation matters. Right now is a time that is critically important to support diverse decision makers and diverse issues for diverse people, especially as it affects the necessary issues around political, social, and judicial reform. This year, in my opinion, is one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And we need to vote this year like our life depends on it, or as the previous person that provided witness that she's a dreamer and she's not able to provide or cast her vote. It's our responsibility and civic duty to do that. We must also build relationships and not walls. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak before the community today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Our first question is from Congresswoman Holland.
Good afternoon, President Holsey. Thank you so much. Really happy to see you. Thank you for your leadership. And I want to I'm glad you mentioned the Broken Promises report, because that essentially does spell out where the United States has been deficient in its trust responsibility. One of those pillars of the report is law enforcement and justice services. And so I wanted to sort of just ask you a question related to that area. We know there is a systemic and historic crisis of violence against Indigenous women. The missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis has been happening since Europeans first came to this continent in the late 1400s and was largely ignored for many, many decades. Congress has been working to remedy violence against women and the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, but what policies would you like to see the next administration support to address this issue?
Thank you for that question, Representative Hallen. It's multifaceted in its approach because, as you know, we are not sub-sovereigns to the U.S. government. We oversee and adhere to our tribal citizens as any other federal government does, whether it be the United States, a state. To your question, I think it largely plays into the adjudication, specifically to the person that is often victimized. With regards to that, it requires, especially through our law enforcement agreements, that adjudication. Sometimes we are unable to adjudicate those that are non-native within our ceded territory. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to be able to provide or afford those necessary protections. I would also like to see some resources. Obviously, there is an enjoyment of historical trauma throughout our history with regards to that, and then the invisibility that exists within our tribal nations. There is the issue of lack of parity that's given to those authorities that are given to our local municipalities, whether it be a county that you are residing in, or even your attorney general. I'm very pleased to see that there are some advancements with regards to task force and other enjoyment by respective departments with regards to this issue, but it is multifaceted in that it's not one person's job, it's everybody's job, and it's interjoined from a judicial perspective to a social service perspective to a behavioral behavioral health perspective, and we have to put resources to that because our women deserve to be provided a safe environment in which they reside in and live in, and foster an environment where if they are harmed or they go missing, that there is efforts to give into them and a platform for them so that we have no more fallen sisters, that we have no more stolen sisters, and that they are treated with the same respect that any other U.S. citizen would be provided.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Anna Lelia.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, President Halsey. Thank you for your very detailed testimony on the multiple ways in which the breach of trust has existed between the United States and tribal nations. I do want to have you come back to speak a little bit about COVID-19 and the current pandemic. Obviously, COVID-19 has taken a disproportionate toll, on tribal nations, exacerbating existing disparities, whether it's infrastructure, lack of healthcare access, water, et cetera. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you would like us as a platform committee and the party overall to focus on and highlight through this process and through the upcoming election and a new administration to really address the needs in the middle of this pandemic?
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's complex because the relationship that we entrust, or as the trustee of the United States, it's a difficult situation. And I think, to your point, COVID-19 really has resulted in a surface or a groundswell of those disparities that exist. For example, in Indian Health Services, there's a disproportionate underfunding of the healthcare needs. And I think that there is this misconception that the United States provides 100% of the need of healthcare for Native American Indians, and that's simply not true. That a majority of the offset for the healthcare needs of our communities are provided directly from the tribal nation itself. And so healthcare is, there was just, because it's a global health pandemic, clearly there were resources that were needed and preparation. I think that the tribal nations have taught the United States a lot of things, that it is not a partisan issue, that it's a human issue, and that we took this very serious because we knew the adverse effects on the most vulnerable. We have some of the most vulnerable healthcare disparities in the entire United States, whether it be from our children with gestational diabetes to our elders. So it created a really unique circumstance for us where we had to be extremely hypervigilant at our approach of how we were going to deal with, because it became a life and death matter. And for us, if to lose one individual, you lose your culture, your language, and your tradition. One is too many to lose. And and from an infrastructure perspective, not all tribes are sovereign, and every tribe has unique challenges. But for many, it came from a resource perspective, especially as it relates from infrastructure, even from an organizational perspective, running a tribal organization. And sometimes, for example, my tribal nation is one of the largest employer in our respective county. So we had a huge responsibility to the embetterment and to provide resources to our community at large. So we had to find different ways from an infrastructure perspective to make sure that we were able to accommodate and meet the needs and challenges of our tribal community from a resource perspective and a service perspective, but also be operational in a safe way. So it's a number of things. For example, we are looking at expansion of obviously basic needs like the Navajo Nation with their need for water, something so basic, to infrastructure of broadband, because you're finding different ways that you have to operate and work, whether it be teleworking or through telemedicine or even through virtual education. So we're finding different ways and creative ways to do that. But I live in a rural community where we sometimes lack that infrastructure in order to facilitate that, even from emergency preparedness perspective, because everything is digital now. So we are finding new ways, but we're also finding those challenges and those weaknesses and areas of gap that need to be provided.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony and representing your people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Halsey, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We will now hear from Janice Poindexter. Ms. Poindexter is the Vice President of the Trans Sisters of Color Project.
Okay, there we go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for sharing space and for allowing me to share space with you all as well. I think this is a topic that is long overdue, and considering just the nation's unrest around the racial inequities and the disparities, it couldn't be a better time to have this particular conversation. So I am Janice Poindexter. I'm the Vice President of Trans Sisters of Color Project. I'm the transgender specialist / victim advocate for Equality Michigan. And I'm also a proud co-chair of the Fair and Equal Michigan Initiative. And so as I speak, as I testify and bear witness, I come from 3 different vantage points. I come from statistics in the sense that I am the statistics. I am the person, the girl that represents a community that has went through so many issues and so much blatant discrimination. I also come from a rendering of service vantage point because fulfilling my roles in my advocacy, I travel throughout the state, and honestly, I've had the opportunity to travel throughout the country to stand up and speak for the community. And so I want you to know that I come from several different places. And as you hear my words, I ask that you open up your spirit and receive them. As a child, I remember reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and taking great pride in the fact that I lived in one of the greatest countries in the world, the United States of America. The architects of the Declaration of Independence repeatedly used the term inherent to describe all of our freedoms. So I thought that the promise of the pursuit of happiness was extended unto me by virtue of being an American citizen. I was taught that this country was not only made up of diverse people, but the diversity was actually celebrated. I thought that all of this was part of the American way. I have quickly learned that I was fooled. somewhere in life, as I was arriving as my authentic self, I realized the very thought of me existing and producing and thriving brings up hateful opposition, and that is manifested in discriminatory laws that are part of a larger system of oppression. This system positions and labels LGBTQ community members as the other, and therefore it has no real intention in honoring us in our existence or just for our humanity. I continue to grapple with the fact that at one point I was working 3 jobs, paying taxes, and ultimately supporting a state's economy that in returns allows landlords to evict me from my housing, that allows doctors to restrict and deny me from receiving comprehensive health care, even though I pay into the very healthcare system with every check that locks me out. And it even allows my employers to terminate my employment, not at the confirmation that I'm gay, lesbian, bi, or trans, at the perceived notion. Attach being Black onto that, and the odds are stacked even further against me. Does this distinguished body know that over the past 10 years, nearly 73% of all transgender women who were killed were Black? As we celebrate Pride Month, I can't help but to center and uplift the Black trans woman and the Latina trans woman who started the riots at Stonewall in 1969. Their names are Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. I thank them for not only starting the movement for the LGBT equality, but for also standing on the front lines against racism, police brutality, and intentional, heinous, harmful acts at that time. It is unnerving to realize that the fight of 1969 is still being fought in 2020. This country appears to finally be awakening to its pervasive and systematic oppression and discriminatory actions against Black people. It appears, too, that reform is on the horizon. Here in the state of Michigan, here in the country even, it is also time for us to reckon with our outdated at-will laws and extend equal protections to LGBTQ members of our society nationwide. How can me and my community members be proud, productive members of society if at any given chance that which sustains us is subject to scrutiny and discrimination under law? Even though my life expectancy as a trans woman is only 35 years old, because we are being killed and hunted down in the streets every day, I am kept and encouraged by the depths of my unwavering faith in God. My hopes and dreams relied on my ability to maintain my relationship with Christ. And as I celebrate Pride, my pride is strengthened in the hope of tomorrow not being the same as yesterday. The discrimination against the LGBTQ community has increased in the past 3 years. And if you add the statistics and the murders of trans women of color, particularly Black trans women, it reaches a level of genocide that is not only maintained, but also, as I stated earlier, increasing. Even reporting victimization from a Black trans woman is under scrutiny. You're guilty first until proven innocent. Instead of allowing freedom and truth to prevail in every situation, this country has made it instinctively possible by law that I am blocked out of healthcare, that I am blocked out of education, that every turn I realize that not only am I not supported, but I also am not honored for my humanity. So when I hear the plight of our immigrant brothers and sisters, when I hear the testimonies that we just heard earlier, and how the young lady who says she can't even vote, but she wants us to remember to vote for her. I wrote that down so that I could. And I also would urge you all to now, even if you can't understand, even if you don't agree, I'll give you that leeway. But do you have to intentionally make life hard? And we'll only see change, real change, in policy. Right now, the murders that happen against the community, particularly with the trans women of color, we don't have even elected officials to pick up these murders and to speak about them, to raise them on the evening news. These women are taxpayers, as I said. These women live in the communities and the districts to which they represent, but they won't connect to that murder and that harm. And that, to me, seems very intentional. If you can look at George Floyd's murder, if you can look at Ahmaud Arbery's murder, please understand that in 40 of our states, there is still an active recognized law called the Gay and Trans Panic Defense. And this means that someone can blow my head off. And the reason that they can have for it can be just because of my identity. And they can say that that intimidates them or that harms them. And I would urge you all to look up a case that involved a Black trans woman named Islam Nettles from New York. And you will see exactly what I mean. And another thing that I would like to raise is that we are at a very critical time in this country where it is our responsibility to center, uplift, and raise all. So in that, let's not forget our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and let's certainly stop turning a blind eye to the literal genocide of Black trans women.
Thank you very much. Our first question is from Congresswoman Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Ms. Poindexter, for your incredibly powerful testimony. And I'm so grateful to the witnesses that have come and shared with us tonight. The statistics that you cite are just horrifying. And we know this, but like you said, too often we are not speaking the victims' names. We are not speaking about the violence, as you put it, genocide of trans women. How do we educate? How do we communicate to policymakers, to the public, about the dangers and risks for trans women of color?
We center those voices. So we are constantly asked those questions. What can we do to do better? What can we do to engage? You can center that voice. And I'll be very blatant here, and please know that I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it is something that kind of stirs up in me every time I go to a training or that I occupy space and there's a white man or a white woman teaching the dynamics of diversity and inclusion. That is a message that I really cannot receive from a white woman or a white man because you don't connect in the same way. And you add being a Black trans woman into that, and you certainly don't connect. So I would say it definitely, find those leaders, find those voices that are willing to be in the front. And then when you find them, support them, invest into them, because it's a difference between me being called on and summoned. But pay me for my expertise, pay me for my experience. As I so carefully laid it out for you, I am deeply entrenched in everything regarding the community. So when I think about intentionality, I think about the aggressive seeking of the person that represents the problem or the issue to which you have not been able to find out.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Poindexter. Thank you for your strength. Thank you for your advocacy work. Thank you for your honesty and passion with this testimony. Very valuable, very helpful for all of us to hear this. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about some of the daily challenges that trans women of color face, just to give us a little better sense of the types of discrimination, what you and others encounter. Could you elaborate a little bit?
I can. So when you think about the overall plight of the LGBTQ community in seeking equality, in seeking a better quality of life, and particularly equity, for which we are addressing with this platform, I think about how the struggle heightens for trans women of color, particularly Black trans women. There is literally little to no statistics because there's no value on our life. So no one has collected the information properly because no one really cares. And I always raise the issue of who watches the watcher. You know, we can sit and talk here till we blue in the face about victimization, about harm, about issues, about policies that are, you know, directly designed to continue to hinder and continue to dismantle the very validity of our lives. But afterwards, you know, when we start these decisions and these rules and these policies, and I'll give you a good example. For one, here in Michigan, in Detroit, particularly Wayne County, there's a transgender policy that has been on the books. You know, I didn't know that it existed. And I am fully entrenched in this work. I work closely with the governor and the lieutenant governor and the LAG and the elected officials. And I did not know that this policy existed. And I also have to go to court. And so we had a young lady who was a Black trans woman who was killed here in the city of Detroit at the end of 2018. Her name is Kelly, and she was killed by a Black pastor here. No one picks up that story. No one airs that dirty laundry. And it was really awakening to me. I was having a conversation with a seasoned Black woman whom I respect very much. And we were talking about the case overall. And I started just telling her about the facts, about the fact that this, you know, she was shot in the middle of the morning and left in the streets. And he went home and took a shower. I mean, he went to work, took a shower and changed his clothes and then called the police. And when you hear chilling testimony as I go into court and you see the experiences, a couple of the ladies were coming down from the community to support behind the family and rally there. And as a couple of the ladies went into the courtroom, I literally heard two police officers, you know, sitting in the hallway, and they were talking about the case and, yeah, you know, and I don't care, you know, I don't care what's going on. I don't think this, and I ain't validating nothing. And it's a so-and-so and so-and-so to me. And I stood there in that moment because they didn't know that I was with the ladies. And they also didn't identify me as trans, but I stood there kind of taken in the moment. And I'm like, wow. The hatred and the thought of standing and putting someone down means so much that you're even willing to do it on your job. out in public because you just choose to be so heinous and so disrespectful. So it was an awakening moment for me. And it, aside from the clear prophecies that I've received from my bishop and from my relationship with Christ, I have been anointed to do this work. I know policy in and out. I sit up and research the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, to make sure that when I occupy these spaces, literally walking in my own privilege as a fully employed Black trans woman, that I bring those stories, I bring those cases, and I bring that reality into the space to really invoke change.
Thank you. Our next question is from President Applebaum.
Good evening, Ms. Poindexter. I also wanted to ask you a question, and I also wanted to thank you for your very powerful testimony. I wanted to ask about last month's Supreme Court ruling, which finally extends civil rights protections to LGBTQ workers from employment discrimination because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. I wanted to ask you, what more do you think needs to be done to make equality in the workplace a reality for LGBTQ people? And thank you.
That is a wonderful question, and thank you for your kind words. I really do appreciate it. I would say that we have to continue to educate. We have to continue to push. That Supreme Court ruling was nice, and I tell you, I have all of my community. I kind of talk with them, and I've gotten some of the kids registered to vote and making sure that they understand the importance of committing to the electoral process. But that Supreme Court ruling was wonderful. But how I put it to my friends and my constituents is that we can't get happy about the red shiny apple. That ruling did not address housing. It did not address public accommodation. It did not address healthcare. So again, as I work and I pay taxes and I substantiate the state's economy, these entities still block me out. As we got the ruling from the Supreme Court, we also, the week prior, got a ruling or an attempt from the Trump administration directly targeted against trans healthcare. So when I think about the success or the win, that was wonderful. But knowing that we still have so much more work to do in coalition building, in policy, writing and restructuring, I think the responsibility really, really lies on our elected officials, those that are meant to represent our issues and our concerns and raise them because we live in their districts, because we are their colleagues. I think we have to challenge our elected officials all around. And I also think we have to really brainstorm and really construct policy that really pushes change and make sure that our community members and the executive directors and the directors of the social justice movement work, making sure that not only they talk the talk, but they walk the walk. Challenge them as they employ community members to make sure that it is a safe environment, to make sure that humanity is honored. Because just because we do LGBTQ work, rest assured that there's a lot of victimization, racism, bigotry, and discrimination, even inside of the movement work. So I just think we really have to challenge and push everyone to make sure that we are representing all of our community's people, to make sure that we are speaking up for all injustice. And if we recognize one murder and one genocide and one harm, then we have to recognize all of it.
Thank you so much. Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Poindexter. And I heard that loud and clear in Atlanta when we formed our LGBTQ advisory committee that there was not a diverse representation. And so I appreciate your reaffirming that. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. God bless everyone.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Dusty Gurule. Ms. Gurule serves as the Executive Director of the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dusty Gurule. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, or COLOR. I also served close to 7 years under President Obama as a regional representative for the Secretary of Labor. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of families and communities of color who struggle to access affordable and safe health care, including reproductive care. Colorado has evolved from red to blue and now from red to purple and now leans blue, thanks to the collective power of a strong progressive movement that holds decision makers accountable to the needs of our communities. COLOR is at the front lines informing and mobilizing the Latinx community to take action and reminding our elected officials that these issues are not controversial, but unequivocally necessary in the fight for human rights. Our families continue to face roadblocks caused by systematic racism and oppression, exacerbated by a president who locks up and separates families, who works to dismantle our healthcare system, and who undermines our basic rights and protections. Now is the time for the Democratic Party to make a clear and unequivocal commitment to the families who have built and continue to keep our economy going. Now is the time for our leaders to take a clear stand for the tenets of reproductive justice, which is a roadmap for not only equality, but dignity and liberation. We must make concrete actions to ensure that every person has the right to decide when and if they will have a child and the conditions under which they will define and expand their families. We must have the right to affordable, culturally competent health care service to support and end a pregnancy in a safe and dignified manner. We must be able to provide and care for our families with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy, sustainable communities without the threat of state-sanctioned violence, like the law that was just struck down by the Supreme Court attempting to limit practitioners to provide care, or the countless attempts to ban abortion across the nation, including right here in Colorado. Everyone should have the freedom to freely express gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexuality freely. To achieve this vision, we ask the Democratic Party for your bold leadership on the following policies. Prioritize reproductive health coverage, including abortion care, regardless of income or insurance type, and to oppose any attempts to put up barriers to that care. These efforts should include young people seeking abortion, contraception, or other forms of reproductive health care. A federal mandate ensuring a paid and family medical leave program that is accessible, affordable, and adequate. This includes at least 12 weeks of family and parental leave. Immediate steps to take to address the immigration and criminal justice systems that cause harm and violence in our communities. The time for action is now. No more broken promises. We're counting on you to ensure that the party platform does more to push our country forward and lift up the families who are often left behind. Representation matters, and something we say at COLOR Action Fund is nothing about us without us. Thank you for your time and commitment.
Thank you. Our first question is from Carmel Martin.
Giving us that terrific testimony. As you point out, it was a good week for women and reproductive health with respect to the Supreme Court. But we also know that the challenges will continue to come forward. So would love to hear from you what you think we need to be thinking about to prepare for those challenges that will be coming through the courts in the future.
So I think here on the ground in Colorado, we are continuing to broaden our coalitions to do general basic education about the importance of removing barriers, of not having any kind of barriers to any kind of abortion care or any kind of reproductive health care, and how important that is to educate our communities and our voters and to have year-round education, civic engagement with our communities. We can't go to people 3 months before an election, 6 months before an election, and ask them to support what we're proposing, whether that's in support of or in opposition of anything on the ballot, right? Or even candidates. When it comes to what's happening with the Supreme Court, continuing to do that education, ensuring that people understand that it's all connected. We have 3 branches of government. They are separate, but they are all impacted by who gets elected and what initiatives get passed during an election. So Color is working diligently to broaden our coalitions, both with community of color organizations and our white ally organizations, working with labor, and important it is to get this overall progressive voice in understanding that all of our issues are intersectional, like nobody lives a single issue life. So we shouldn't work that way. We shouldn't only focus on one thing, because always holding those most vulnerable at the center of everything that we do raises all boats, right? So all boats will rise. And so that's really the focus, the crux of a lot of the work that we do and that we're doing here in Colorado, and also nationally with a lot of national partners. But again, and I think one of the reasons that I mentioned that I worked for Secretary of Labor, first Secretary Solis and then Secretary Perez, was the importance of working both with community-based organizations, community grassroots leaders, but also working with local, state, and federal in those cross-agency conversations and coalitions. Again, breaking down silos, working through transparency of issues, because we're all in this together. And if we continue to have those conversations and figure out where the alignments are, how can we support, how can we leverage, the better off we'll all be.
That's great. Well, thank you for all the work you're doing.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Orton has our next question.
Thanks, and thanks for your testimony. You know, we all know what a national concentrated attack reproductive rights has been under, not just in the last few years, but especially in the last few years, as we've seen these sort of concerted efforts at the federal and the state and the local level. And I'm a bit reminded by your testimony of something that, you know, then Governor Mario Cuomo said in the 80s when he went to Notre Dame, and that, you know, at the time it was Medicaid funding, but that cutting funding for abortion would not prevent people with money, women with money, from getting abortions. It would prevent, it would impose financial burdens on poor people from having access to reproductive care. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how, and obviously that's been a strategy of those attacking reproductive rights, as we've seen with the fake health clinics and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about the more concrete ways that an administration or a Democratic majority can enshrine those rights, those constitutional rights, in law going forward in a durable way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one way that Congress can help and really be a leader is overturning the Hyde Amendment, which is the federal ban on using any public funds. Yeah. Right here in Colorado, we also have our state version of that, which at some point, that is something that we want to address and overturn. You know, I think all of these attacks on communities, not just in reproductive health care, but LGBTQ, you know, the incarceration of our young and brown and Black communities, people, the systematic violence. A lot of the proponents that are pushing those, they're all working together behind the scenes. And so I think
that's right. Yeah,
we need to be smarter and do the same, right? And talk about how it is that we leverage all of these relationships. And we know words matter, and leadership matters, and how important it is for our leaders to be modeling good behavior and what you put out there. And I'm not very like spiritual, but I do believe that what you put out there will come. And so the more that our national leaders, even the decision makers all the way down to school board members, like how important it is what you say models actions that people will take. And so I think the more that we can talk about removing all barriers, removing all discrimination when it comes to the full range of reproductive health care, including abortion care, is so critical. And thank you for calling fake clinics what they are, fake clinics. And just a quick example, we worked with and again, relationships matter. We worked with our city officials here to ensure that there were no city resources going to support any fake clinics, because they put billboards in communities where most vulnerable people are, who may not understand what's available in healthcare. So following the money and making changes there. But I think it's exhausting, but I think it's possible the more that we can work in collaboration and coalition.
Great. Thank you so much for your work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'd now like to recognize Austin Keyser, who serves as the Director of Political and Legislative Affairs at the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to the Drafting Committee for inviting me to testify today. I know we're on short time, so I'll dive right in. My comments are focused on an exciting new partnership that the IBEW is proud to be part of, and will become the driving force for real climate and energy policy in the future. The Labor Energy Partnership, LEP, is based on a shared commitment of the AFL-CIO and the Energy Futures Initiative to federal, regional, and state energy policies that promote economic equality based on quality jobs and the preservation of workers' rights, while also addressing the growing climate crisis. The LEP is guided by the following principles. 1, energy policy must be based on solid scientific review that acknowledges climate change is real, anthropogenic, and represents an existential threat to human society. 2, successful social solutions to climate change must be based on an all-of-the-above energy source strategy that is regionally focused, flexible, preserves optionality, and addresses the crisis of stranded workers. 3, an essential priority of all climate policy solutions is the preservation of existing jobs, wherever possible, and the creation of new ones that are equal to or better than those displaced. And 4, climate policy represents an economic opportunity to the United States when the benefits of new technology deployment result in the creation of quality jobs and the creation of competitive domestic supply chains. The partnership will be implemented through a joint steering committee consisting of Richard Trumka, President of the AFL-CIO, Cecil Roberts, President of the United Mine Workers of America and Chair of the AFL-CIO Energy Committee, and my boss, Lonnie Stevenson, President of the IBEW and Vice Chair of the AFL-CIO Energy Committee. And from the Energy Futures Initiative, it's Secretary Ernest Moniz and his colleagues, Melanie Kinderdine and Joseph Hazier. The Labor Energy Partnership is identified as an initial action agenda of energy and policy analysis over the next 2 years, and includes, but is not limited to, the following focus areas. 1, a national action plan for the deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration technology. 2, a priority energy infrastructure analysis that provides a roadmap for key energy infrastructure needs, financing mechanisms, and approval and permitting pathways. 3, policies needed to site and permit new electricity transmission projects in the near term. 4, options for safe, affordable preservation of existing nuclear fleet and the deployment of the next generation of nuclear technologies. 5, deployment of technology and policy pathways for the use of natural gas consistent with meeting climate goals. 6, an exploration of the economic challenges and cost benefit of the development of hydrogen fuels, alternative for the transportation and industrial sectors. 7, the expansion of energy efficiency finance mechanisms and policy recommendations to enable the full utilization of energy efficient technologies in commercial and residential buildings, industrial processes, and transportation. 8, an assessment of the domestic capacity of the United States to mine, process, and manufacture the critical minerals and materials necessary for the domestic production of low carbon technology, including rare earths, lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, palladium, and other essential minerals. 9, analysis of offshore wind supply, including its raw material requirements and manufacturing technologies, and geographical differences between the East Coast, West Coast, Great Lakes, resources and policy options to encourage domestic development. And 10, a roadmap for implementing carbon dioxide removal at scale. Thanks again for your time and your important work on doing this. I hope that you'll rely and lean on this group and this committee that Labor and Energy have come together to structure as you design future energy policy. And with that, I'm happy to take your question.
Thank you. Our first question is from President Trumka.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms. Austin, thank you for your testimony. And first, let me congratulate the IBEW, first under the leadership of late President Ed Hill, and now under the leadership of Lonnie Stevenson, of not only adopting, but implementing a code of excellence in your industry that seeks to keep your members the most skilled craftsmen in the industry. I want to thank you for that. Let me ask you this. Tell us about establishing labor standards in renewable energy and IBEW's experience in helping workers in that sector form unions.
Yeah, it's a complex world and one I'm glad we're going to talk about. So it's far easier said than done. While the IBEW is currently seeing job growth and we're promoting job growth in the renewable industry sector, it's largely anti-union and it tends to stay that way at all costs in some arenas. So the green economy has become code for certain corporate interests to pocket federal and state incentives and hire low-wage non-union workers while purchasing all their manufacturing goods from overseas, mostly from China. We have to stop that. So current federal tax incentives, which are the primary policy tools used to support the renewable industry, exclude any requirements for wind, solar, or battery storage to purchase US-made supplies, pay their workers a living wage, or to collectively bargain with their workers. The same is true for incentives on electric vehicles. The injustice must be addressed if we're going to build a more equitable future for all Americans. We need federal and state policies that will require industries to take taxpayer money to build and assemble the manufactured products in the future in the United States. This is the best opportunity for a nation has to rebuild our manufacturing sector. The vision will take time and resources, but it's critical that policymakers make these investments in the American people if we're going to achieve a more equitable future.
Thanks, Austin.
Thank you.
Right. Next, we have President Applebaum.
Austin, good evening. I have to say that your union is one of the finest in the country and does important work. I was pleased to hear you talk about new technology employment. And my question is actually somewhat similar to President Trumka's. And what I'd really like to know is if you could expand a little more on the economic potential of clean energy technology.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you for your leadership on the Labor Council at the DNC and making sure our voices are heard all the time. So we certainly couldn't do what we do without voices like you, making sure that we have platforms to do it. So yeah, new technologies, clean technologies. First, we have to define what that means, right? I mean, there are new sort of emerging renewable technologies that exist. We have to understand their capabilities, where they fit in the market. A lot of them are intermittent energy sources. So some of them have some limitations on them, but we also have to think about in this terms, things like advanced nuclear technologies that can not only produce massive amounts of electricity with very little fuel, it can be smaller in the future and built, all over the country, but hopefully with the potential to recycle the existing waste that we have, which, by the way, in the energy sector is very little. Sometimes it gets conflated with our weapons grade uranium waste. So there's very little of it actually out there. And we have to think about carbon capture and sequestration technologies and utilization of our national laboratories. We're doing that because for two reasons. One is natural gas is going to have to be around for a while as a baseload power source. We know that. Anybody who's living in the realities of the energy world will say that. But also because in the industrial sector, it's probably the only way in the private industrial sector that we're going to decarbonize. But getting back to your question, look, solar panel manufacturing, clean appliances, wiring harnesses, all the way down the line, transformers, all of these new things that make up the components of what we imagine as the green, modernized electric grid are mostly not made here. We have very few of these things happening here. But we can drive a real domestic policy in both manufacturing, installation of these products, and the service of these products in the future. Right now, we mostly have the sales jobs and some of the installer jobs. And the unfortunate part is that even a lot of our allies decouple. They're taking part of, say, the electrician's craft. They're taking their trade and they parcel it out into a smaller section that is on the lower skilled side of it. And they try to call that a new craft or something that as if it never existed before. And as if we don't know how to do it. In fact, every IBEW electrician can install solar panels, but no solar technicians can build a massive grid infrastructure, can build nuclear power plants, things like that. So we want solar installers, but we want solar installers to be part of a trade that will give them a future, give them a real skill set that makes them valuable and allows them to move on beyond a job and into a career. So it's important. The manufacturing base, very important. Cars, electrifying the electric vehicle sector, electrifying high-speed rail. These are all massive things that are going to create a big job growth. It's just up to us. Is that job growth in the United States, or is that job growth given to a foreign company or to U.S. corporations who choose to do their manufacturing and their business overseas? So we have to bring that here. We have to domesticate it all the way from, I think when you heard me outline the things, they're actually in a logical order. And President Trumpko was very instrumental in making that happen, is that it starts from the point where we have to extract these things out of the ground. Wind and the sun are renewable. They come out every day, but the devices that we have to build and the transmission lines that we have to build to transmit that are not renewable resources. And we have to realize that and grapple with that. And as a Democratic Party, we hope we'll engage that. There's so many people that have been displaced, especially in battleground states, that need to hear that from the party. And I think there are plenty in the party that believe that and hold these principles with us. And we hope to engage and we hope to utilize these studies and these research to make sure that we're driving policy in that direction and giving credibility to it with the workers out there.
Austin, thank you so much. It's so important that we make sure that the jobs that result from new technology are good jobs.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Keyser. Next, we will hear from Nsé Ufot, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the New Georgia Project Action Fund. Can you unmute yourself?
You would think I would have this by now. Good evening and greetings to my mayor, Mayor Bottoms. Hello. And thank you for the opportunity to share today. One of the proudest moments of my life was the day that my mother and I became American citizens. My mother, a single parent with school-aged children, worked 2 jobs, saving a considerable amount of money to pay for our naturalization and citizenship fees. Late at night, she proudly watched as I led our family's civic study group and made sure that we all knew the oath of allegiance by heart. America was already our home, and we were honored to finally become citizens. I carry the memories of those early years with me. To this day, I am deeply invested in how our government works and who represents me, my community, and our interests in the halls of power. Central to that is making sure that I am faithfully executing my duty as a citizen, using my power to vote. Perhaps it's because I watched my mother sacrifice, saving pennies that added up to dollars. Or perhaps it's because denying generations of Black people the opportunity to fully exercise and express citizenship is all too common, making our country and democracy weak and vulnerable. Or maybe it's because of both, but I take my role as a citizen very seriously, and I encourage you all to do the same. Candidly, this is why I vote, and it's also why, as the CEO of the New Georgia Project, I lead a team of hundreds of staff and volunteers that work every day to ensure that voter ID laws, targeted precinct closings, massive purges of the voter rolls, and other acts meant to exclude people of color, students, immigrants, and the poor will ultimately fail. While combating unjust laws and policies, the New Georgia Project Action Fund seeks out those that are not represented and offers a path to become involved on issues that matter most to them. It's why we've registered more than 420,000 Georgians of color and young voters since our launch. It's why we will register 1 million eligible but unregistered people of color in our state, and then flex our collective power at the ballot box, from City Hall to Georgia's Gold Dome to Capitol Hill. Those early memories of sacrifice and commitment are why I'm here to share out loud what we've only quietly discussed. The Georgia, Kentucky, and Wisconsin primaries are examples of the results of a massive, well-funded, targeted attack on our nation's elections infrastructure and a $1 billion campaign to elect a president. If we do not consider how successful voter suppression has worked in these elections, then we are not serious about winning. Consider this. Black voters are the targets of disinformation campaigns led by bad actors, both foreign and domestic. Thousands of polling locations across the country were closed and consolidated during the primaries, and that number will go up as we head into the general. The COVID-19 global pandemic is being used as pretext to suppress more votes of Americans. If the DNC is serious about having free and fair elections, then its platform should at the very least include the end to racist laws and practices that suppress votes, the end to partisan gerrymandering, full restoration and expansion of the Voting Rights Act, an overturn of Citizens United, implementing nationwide automatic voter registration, reinstating full voting rights to those currently and formerly incarcerated, and lowering the voting age to 16. As I declared my oath of allegiance with my mothers years ago, I vowed to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our democracy is under attack, but I believe in us. For me, my mother, and so many like us, the Democratic Party platform should protect the core beliefs of this nation, and the sanctity of voting is at the very top. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your representation of Atlanta. Our first question is from Secretary Vilsack.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, I want to thank you very much for putting a focus and a spotlight on a critically important issue. Everything we've talked about for the last 2 days in this platform drafting effort is very much dependent on who gets elected. And who gets elected obviously is dependent on who gets to vote. You have some amazing statistics when you talk about over 400,000 folks who are now registered to exercise the most precious right in a democracy. You've mentioned some of the challenges, but I'm very interested in your take on what you see are the most immediate challenges between now and November as it relates to voting, and what you see as more long-term challenges and opportunities.
Well, thank you for that, Secretary Vilsack. So immediate challenges. We are preparing for a spike in coronavirus, not just in Georgia, but across the country. And so we have been working to sort of make the case that absentee voting or vote by mail is the safest option available to voters now. We saw a last minute bill that was introduced in the Georgia legislative session that sought to narrow those who had access to vote by mail. I don't think that Georgia is unique in any way. And so as we start thinking about, so there are two things with vote by mail. One, it represents a culture change for states like Washington State, for states like Colorado. They've been voting by mail. They've had universal vote by mail for quite some time. It represents a culture change. So convincing voters that, while we know that voter suppression is rampant, that vote by mail is the safest choice, again, minimizing their exposure to the virus, but also providing a paper trail so that we can have an accurate auditing and that we can restore faith in the elections process. I don't think that vote by mail is a panacea at all. I think that there are limitations, folks living with disabilities, poor people, et cetera. But it is a critical intervention that can be made. And we see secretaries of state who are not excited about the expansion of voting, figuring out ways to limit that. California is being sued by the RNC, et cetera. And so the threat to vote by mail, the expansion of vote by mail is a critical issue that I think can be and should be addressed in this moment. I think that when we talk about long-term strategy, the threats come from all over the place. Again, we know that voter fraud is not real, but voter suppression is. And so the restoration of the Voting Rights Act and an expansion of the Voting Rights Act. We know that with the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court case, that sections 4 and sections 5 were gutted. And those were pre-clearance states that had a history of voter suppression. I would argue that all states should be subject to the former provisions in Section 4 and Section 5, meaning that if there's a desire to change election dates, if there's a desire to close polling locations or merge polling locations, if there's a desire to do massive purges in the way that they do that in Georgia, that they get it pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or by a court.
Well, I want to thank you very much for that. And I also want to thank you in your testimony for focusing on felon voting rights. Unfortunately and tragically, I live in the state, which is the only state in the country that has not restored felon voting rights. I did as a governor, but it was subsequently eliminated by Republican governors. So if you want to move to Iowa, we'd love to have you for a couple of months.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation.
And so many things you've highlighted. I requested an absentee ballot and never received one. And what so many people don't recognize, our early voting was just as bad, if not worse, than election day, with people reporting standing in line 6 to 8 hours to early vote. Someone told me about standing in line until 2:30 in the morning. And then I had a cousin who showed up to vote who had been purged for a felony conviction, and he doesn't have a felony conviction. So for everything that everyone saw, we know being here, it was 10 times worse.
Absolutely.
Congresswoman Holland has the next question.
Thank you so much, and say for all of the wonderful work you're doing. I am Native American, and I worked in Indian country in New Mexico for a long time. And so I know the challenges, and I appreciate everything you're doing to make sure that this most critical right of our citizens to vote is protected, expanded. Every single thing you're doing, I'm so appreciative of. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to focus a little bit on voting during this pandemic. And we know that COVID-19 puts additional pressures on our electoral system. And the past few primaries have been highlighted by the difficulties in keeping voters and poll staff safe while ensuring ballot access. What policies do you recommend that states implement to ensure ample and safe access to voters in the November election?
Right. I think an aggressive recruitment of more poll workers. It is often the age. So it's been the statistic that the average age of the poll worker is 70 years old is often used as pretext for all of the problems that voters experience at the polling location. I think that, again, an aggressive recruitment of more poll workers. I think that there are more polling locations. We should not be experiencing the closing and the consolidation of polling locations in this moment, but more polling locations so that machines can be physically distanced in a way so that voters can be safe. I think that resourcing secretaries of state and county boards of elections with the materials that are needed to wipe down machines between voters, I think is really important. I think the expansion of in-person early voting could be a critical intervention in this moment. As I've said already, the expansion of absentee balloting and vote by mail would be a critical intervention in this moment, and not either or, right? So I see some conversations happening where folks are saying that we'll expand vote by mail, and that will justify the closing of polling locations. I think that both and giving American voters the choice in this moment about the way to vote and protect themselves. We saw them implement ballot boxes in Georgia, so voters didn't necessarily have to mail their ballots to return them, that they could drop them off at lock boxes around the county. I also think that vote centers in Georgia, during early voting, there are massive vote centers where you can vote anywhere in the county. But on election day, folks are still required to vote in their neighborhood polling location. I think extending that to election day could also sort of ease some of the long lines that voters are experiencing when they're attempting to vote.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We will now hear from Carolyn Siegel-Singh, who is a recent graduate of UC San Diego and will be pursuing a master's at UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to address you all on a topic so critical to our nation's success: college affordability and student debt. As a student who has worked extensively in California's higher education sphere, it is an honor to address you all today on ways that we can create a more equitable nation through higher education. Because for today's students, education beyond high school goes hand in hand with upward social mobility. This means that for students like myself, access to apprenticeships and post-secondary education is critical to obtaining quality jobs. And unfortunately, continual state disinvestment coupled with rising institutional expenses has left today's students shouldering the burden of college costs in ways that our predecessors just a generation ago did not. The collegiate experience has transformed as a result of this disinvestment in our generation. No longer are students hopping between just classes and extracurriculars. Most have to take on multiple part-time jobs, often at the same time, to afford both their tuition and basic needs such as food and housing, while still taking on debt. Growing student debt also influences the decisions that we make and the jobs that we take after we graduate. I'm here today to ask you to include the following policies into the 2020 Democratic National Platform. As we've seen in California, 2 years of free tuition at the community college level is not only possible, but can be a crucial part in any plan to increase accessibility and affordability for all those who seek to better their own life through higher education. Community colleges are critical to providing an affordable pathway for all students, and an ideal plan would go even further and eliminate tuition for both low-income and middle-class students at four-year public universities as well. We also know that the cost of college goes beyond just tuition. As someone who concluded their undergraduate experience just a few days ago, I've seen firsthand the impact that these costs bear on all students in different ways. Food and housing insecurity are the result of decreased purchasing power of grant aid programs such as the Pell Grant that have not increased along with inflation. Doubling the value of the maximum Pell Grant would immediately help today's students. And while we work to ensure access and affordability for low-income students, more needs to be done to protect the dwindling American middle class. Extending Pell Grant eligibility to middle-class students in need of support would ensure that working-class students are not being priced out of these institutions. And in an effort to further expand equal access, there's also a need for restoration of Pell Grant eligibility to those who are formerly incarcerated. For many non-traditional students, think student parents, student veterans, and students with disabilities, there's a critical need for wraparound services to exist and provide all students with equal access to academic success. The creation of new Title I resources in collaboration with community-based organizations can actually decrease the number of these students leaving institutions with debt, but no degree. And while it is important to improve the system for future students, Student borrowers still repaying their loans need lower payments and accessible paths to loan forgiveness, including those in public service. Income-driven repayment plans help, but they need to be improved to reach more borrowers who struggle to make those payments. As it currently stands, our public service loan forgiveness program is broken. As a country, we need to ensure that public service is being both incentivized and properly rewarded for our recent graduates. This could be done through a new and simplified program that would offer any recent graduate with up to $10,000 in relief every year for up to 5 years total. And finally, not all debt is created equally. And as the proud child of a disabled veteran, I ask that you include language to eliminate the 90-10 loophole, which has incentivized predatory for-profit institutions to enroll veterans into educational programs that do not lead to quality jobs, thus using up their hard-earned lifetime educational benefits with little to no direct benefit to the individual. Thank you all for allowing me to address the committee. I can answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Our first question is from Dr. Gottney.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. And thanks so much, Ms. Siegel-Singh, for your testimony. And congratulations on your recent graduation. I just like to say I could not agree more with you about the need for increased investment in our public colleges and universities. And I especially appreciate your point about students having to take on so many jobs. I'm a professor at Fordham University, and I see this among my students, and it's an incredible challenge and something that we really need to fix. So in your testimony, you mentioned student debt, an issue that afflicts so many Americans. Can you talk about the emotional impact of student debt and also the ways in which it impacts financial decisions for, for new graduates and, people, just entering the workforce, interested in plugging into the economy, but, saddled with this burden?
Yeah, well, from my personal experience, I remember applying to undergraduate institutions, and my thought process as someone whose family falls below federal poverty guidelines was that I would go to the school with the lowest total cost, which led me to UC San Diego, where they actually covered the full cost of my 4 years. And when considering graduate education, I initially believed that I was essentially priced out, and without the availability of grant aid or generous scholarships, it would not be an option for me. That changed my junior year when I was able to receive a fellowship that would pay for the cost of attendance for my graduate education. So there's definitely a way that the cost of college is shaping behavior for my peers. And it's not only the institutions that we choose, it's the decisions that we make while in those institutions as well. For example, if you have the option between a wonderful internship in the field that you want to work that would allow you networking and opportunities for future jobs, but it's unpaid, most low-income students, if not all, will be unable to take that opportunity and will instead work on campus in the cafeteria or do some other job unrelated to the field that they want to pursue because they need to pay the bills. You also see the impact of intergenerational wealth or the lack of impacting a lot of our students in that particularly Black students nationally take on higher amounts of debt. And that is a really concerning trend because you're replicating really intergenerational poverty when you have folks that are unable to purchase new cars after graduation, they're unable to make moves to a different city to pursue jobs, and they're unable to start saving for things like homes. It shapes our financial decisions for decades.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Ms. Siegel, and thank you for your testimony. I was particularly interested in your discussion about Pell Grant increases, which we are fighting for vigorously at Delaware State University, where more than half of our students are Pell Grant eligible. I also noted the concern around having to take a job outside of your field just to pay the bills. I wanted to point your attention to what I know you know about the CARES Act. They put a temporary pause on student loan payments through September. But I don't think that's enough. I think you probably would agree with that. But with respect to the short-term policies that you want to see implemented to help people like yourself, recent college graduates, trying to start their way in the world successfully, what kind of policies do you think should be put in place immediately as it relates to those who are struggling with those loans?
Well, I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to incentivize public service. And you have a large population of highly educated recent graduates who are going to have their student loan payments restarting in September that need jobs. So I would love to see something like a federal work study that continues post-graduation, or some other opportunities to find employment. You could work as contact tracers or within a federal or state agency. At this point, my peers need employment, and we're being pushed out of the job market because of rising unemployment.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was a Pell Grant recipient, so I especially appreciate your testimony today. Thank you for joining us. Next, we will hear from Valerie Hill-Rawls, who is the director of the Black-Green Agenda.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to see you all this evening. I am the director of the New Georgia Project, Black and Green Agenda, and I'm coming to you this evening to speak on behalf of the vulnerable residents of Georgia. Particularly, I'm addressing those residents who live in the Georgia Black Belt. We have identified 26 counties in the Georgia Black Belt where we are going to address the intersection of racial justice, democracy, and environmental justice. So I'm speaking tonight simply to ask that the leaders would consider to decisively act on the situations that will continue to erode the environment, health, and the economy of individuals who are living in the rural Black Belt of Georgia, as well as Metro Georgia, Atlanta as well. We must focus on the environmental crisis while also acknowledging and addressing the inequities that are a part of the destruction to and the responses to environmental impacts of people of color. In particular, let me give you a few highlights of the environmental reality here in Georgia. 6 million Georgians live in areas that have been evaluated for risk for wildfires due to our extreme heat. 13,000 properties here in Georgia are at risk for flooding, and $114 billion has been spent on damages from the last 13 climate-related disasters here in Georgia. However, these statistics are only the first part of the story. Those elements, combined with the existing institutional barriers that are disproportionately affecting the impacts of people of color in the Southeast and the rural communities across this nation. This disservice is compounded by our community's isolation, the conflict that they have with entities that are responsible for emergency planning and responses. For example, the conflicts between communities and government and non-governmental agencies, distrust of law enforcement and the justice system, and the social and political exclusion impairs the ability for some minority communities to withstand environmental disasters, which we've seen in the past with Katrina and subsequent disasters afterwards. In addition, Americans of color often experience emergency preparedness through extremely skewed sets of institutions compared to white Americans. We must address these gaps in political, social, and emergency networks that are obstacles to building environmentally resilient and sustainable communities. As the communities of color haven't suffered enough, and they have to combat so many different variables as we do our daily lives. Residential and social segregation remain social capital, from healthcare to law enforcement agencies, schools, and universities. If community-based environmental emergency assistance is, and reassert local responsibility. Policymakers must consider the community's institutional barriers to prohibit equal access. This starts with acknowledging that learn the magnitude and the location of these barriers. They must address the civil rights issues within emergency responses at a new scale from both institutional and community. Our ability to acknowledge, examine, and to act to overcome these change the world starting with our own backyard. These are the tools that are needed to create a vibrant community for all generations to come. I thank you for allowing me to address these issues, because what we're finding here in Georgia, particularly in the rural Black Belt, that the environmental issues have been actually utilized to suppress voting. So when we have inclement weather for the GOT get out to vote, window of time, that's when hurricanes occur. So they're using weather occurrences to close voting places, close the post office, to create an impediment around access to be able to continue to vote. So what we're doing with the New Georgia Project, we found that when the voter registration took place, that there were issue IDs that people would express, particularly people of color, that they were concerned about the environmental impacts in their communities. So I would hope and I deplore that the leadership of the Democratic Party would start to address some of the environmental atrocities that people of color have suffered disproportionately for a very long time. So I thank you. I congratulate each and every one of you for the roles that you played to uplift humanity. And I thank you, Mayor Bottoms, for the role that you're playing to support us here in Georgia. So you all have a wonderful evening, and I'm open to all of your questions.
Thank you so much. Our first question is from Anna Lilia.
Greetings, Ms. Rawls. So we know that environmental justice is integral when it comes to eliminating or tackling disparities, not only in health outcomes, but also economic outcomes. And it is a core part of cornerstone of the Black Lives Matter movement. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you would like, what key priorities leaders within the environmental justice community would like this platform, this prioritized through this election and in the future administration?
Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that I think the leadership would like to see, including myself, is that we really start to take a look at some of the systemic issues that people have to contend with environmentally every day. Environmental justice isn't a siloed issue. It deals with everything that one has to do from the time you wake up in the morning, the institutions that you have to engage with during the course of the day. I think if we stop looking at environmental justice as a silo, but start to look at the integrated impact from economic development, affordable housing, access to public transportation, if we start to have the leadership to look at it from a more holistic perspective, instead of these individual silos, we can get more traction and we can actually move the agenda forward in a collective body to address all of the integrated life experiences that one has. So I think we're moving more, even in the environmental justice movement, to speak of it more holistically, because you had people that were more concerned about place. Then you had individuals talking about healthcare. You have individuals talking about, public transportation. I think what Black Lives Matter has done, they look at it more holistically, which historically that has not been the case, because social justice and environmental justice, they were two separate entities. Now that we've included social and environmental justice together, I think that the effects and the impact of the inclusion and the intersectionality will give us a chance to bring down some of the barriers that have impeded us to move forward with the environmental justice policies that are going to be more beneficial to people of color and Indigenous people as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. And before we end, I'd like to note that we were going to be joined by two wonderful fellow mayors, but who could not be with us this evening because of last minute conflicts. That was Mayor Mariela Melendez Altieri from the city of Ponce and Mayor Carmen Yulin Cruz from San Juan. They have been at the forefront of rebuilding our communities after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And they also know all too well how the Trump administration has left our brothers and sisters and fellow Americans in Puerto Rico out in the cold during this critical time. We will make sure to share their statements with all of the drafting committee members. And that concludes our hearing for today. Thank you to all of our witnesses who joined us. We truly appreciate their perspectives and recommendations on how to best address issues that are facing our country. Drafting committee members, we have been given a lot to process today, but I know we can work together to put together a platform that reflects our shared and collective values and is a tool to elect Joe Biden president. As a reminder, our final hearing will be held on tomorrow. It will begin at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The theme for tomorrow's hearing is the restoring of the soul of America. You can watch us live on the Democratic National Convention's YouTube channel. We also want to remind you to go online to stories.demconvention.com to share your thoughts and ideas. Have a great evening, and thank you, Anna Lelia, for your patience with me again this evening. Have a good evening, everyone.